In a world where fortunes rot in forgotten corners, one woman's desperation led her to a miracle no one believed was real. Elena Cruz, a single mother on the edge of losing everything, clicked on an online auction, bidding $300 on a rusted cargo plane abandoned in a desert graveyard. To her, it was scrap metal. To history, it was a sealed vault of secrets. What she found hidden inside those cold steel walls would shatter governments, rewrite legacies, and turn a mother's gamble into a $400 million storm of truth, greed, and redemption. And it all began with that click. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. It came down in thin, bitter lines against the cracked window of a second-floor apartment that no longer felt like home. Inside, the lights flickered, casting restless shadows across the peeling wallpaper. Elena Cruz sat by the window, her fingers gripping a shut-off notice from the power company. Each word on the paper felt heavier than the rain outside. The bills had piled up like ghosts she could no longer ignore. Her son slept in the next room, unaware that by morning they might have nowhere to go. She had done everything right, or so she thought. Worked double shifts, taken on every freelance job she could find, skipped meals so her child wouldn't have to. But the world had stopped caring about people like her. When the factory closed and the calls stopped coming, the silence became its own kind of punishment. That night, she sat at her old laptop, its cracked screen glowing dimly, and scrolled through the classifieds with the same hollow hope she'd clung to for months. Used furniture, broken appliances, rusted cars, things abandoned by others, sold for pennies. And then she saw it. Decommissioned military cargo plane starting bid $300. At first, she laughed, a dry, humorless sound in the empty room. What use did she have for a plane? But something about the listing froze her finger over the trackpad. The image was faded and grainy, showing a massive aircraft half buried in sand, its wings drooping like the arms of a fallen giant. The description said it was located in a retired airfield outside the Mojave. Pickup only, no guarantees. Something inside her stirred. Maybe it was the absurdity of it, or the strange beauty of that forgotten machine. Maybe it was the thought that something left behind still had worth. Or maybe she was just tired of feeling powerless. She placed a bid. The screen refreshed, and a simple message appeared. "Congratulations, you are the highest bidder." For a moment, she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The sound that escaped her throat was somewhere between both. Her hands trembled as she stared at the confirmation email. $300, almost everything she had left. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just opened a door. Not a door to escape her problems, but to something waiting in the dark. Something bigger than she could understand. Outside, thunder rolled low across the sky, echoing like a warning. Elena looked toward her son's door and whispered softly, "We're going to be okay." The words didn't feel like a lie. They felt like a promise to herself, to whatever future might still be willing to listen. She shut the laptop and sat in silence, listening to the storm fade into a slow drizzle. The city lights shimmered through the wet glass like distant fires. And somewhere between exhaustion and resolve, Elena Cruz decided that tomorrow she'd drive out to that desert airfield. She didn't know it yet, but the moment her tires touched the runway, her life would split cleanly in two. The part before the plane and everything that would come after. As the clock struck midnight, the power went out. Darkness filled the room. Only the faint hum of rain remained, steady and patient, as if the world itself was holding its breath for what was about to begin. The morning broke pale and silent, the kind of dawn that felt more like an ending than a beginning. Elena loaded what little she had into her faded sedan, a cracked thermos of coffee, an old camera, and the printout of her winning bid. Her son, Matteo, still slept under a patched blanket. She kissed his forehead softly, whispered that she'd be back soon, and slipped out before the weight of her doubts could stop her. The city gave way to the open highway, mile after mile of faded asphalt cutting through the desert's emptiness. The sky widened until it seemed endless, a vast ocean of light swallowing everything that dared to move beneath it. Her thoughts drifted between fear and faith, tangled together like the lines on the map she barely understood. She kept wondering why she'd done it. Why not save that money for rent, for food, for something that made sense? But maybe that was the point. It didn't have to make sense. Maybe she needed something irrational, something reckless, to feel alive again. Hours passed. The radio crackled with static before giving up completely. The road turned to dirt, then to sand. She followed the faint trail of an old sign that read Airfield 17 Restricted Access. The letters were nearly gone, worn smooth by decades of sun and wind. When she arrived, the sight before her stole the breath from her chest. It was a graveyard of wings. Dozens of rusted aircraft stood like forgotten giants, their metal skin flaking under the sun, their once proud insignias fading into pale ghosts. Some had collapsed into the sand, half wallowed by time. Others stood tall and broken, their shadows stretching across the ground like scars. At the far end she saw it, the cargo plane from the listing, massive, dust-caked, silent. Its nose pointed slightly downward, as if it were bowing to the desert that had claimed it. A man stepped out from a small shack near the fence. His skin was leathered by years of sun, his hat tilted low over eyes that seemed to know too much. "You the buyer?" he asked, his voice dry as gravel. Elena nodded, holding up her papers. "Elena Cruz. I sent the payment yesterday." He looked her up and down, then at the plane. "Didn't think anyone would actually come for that thing. Been sitting there since the 90s. Used to belong to the Air Force. They stripped it for parts. Mostly." "Mostly?" she asked. He smirked faintly. "Let's just say some things are better left sealed." The words hung in the air longer than they should have. Elena tried to smile, pretending his tone didn't unsettle her. "I just need to get inside. Maybe I can sell the metal or use it for storage." The caretaker shrugged. "Your call. Keys are in the cockpit. Don't stay after dark. The coyotes get bold around here." She nodded, though something in his warning felt heavier than it sounded. As she walked closer, the size of the plane consumed her. The air was thick with heat and dust. Every step crunched against the brittle earth. When she reached the fuselage, she ran her hand across the metal, warm, rough, alive with history. The door resisted her pull, but with a groan of old hinges it opened. Inside, the air was still and heavy. Light filtered through cracks in the hull, slicing the darkness into golden lines. The scent of oil and rust lingered like a memory. She climbed the narrow ladder into the cockpit. Dust lay thick on every surface. A small bird's nest rested atop one of the control panels, a fragile home built inside a machine once made for power and flight. Elena sat in the pilot's seat, her fingers brushing over faded switches. For a moment, she imagined what it must have felt like to fly this beast through clouds and storms, to hear its engines thunder across the sky. But then she noticed something, a folder wedged beneath the instrument panel, sealed with tape so old it had turned yellow. Written in black marker were 2 words, Operation Silverlight. She frowned, turning the folder in her hands. The pages inside were brittle, typed in a language of codes and signatures she didn't understand. But one thing caught her eye, a stamped symbol of the U.S. Air Force, dated 1968. Her pulse quickened. What was this doing here? Outside, the wind began to rise, whistling through the gaps in the metal. It sounded almost like a whisper, a warning carried by time itself. Elena closed the folder, her mind spinning. She had come here chasing scraps of hope, but now she felt something else stirring beneath the surface. Mystery older and deeper than her own struggle. As she stepped out of the cockpit, the desert stretched endlessly before her, the sunlight burning gold across the horizon. She took one last look at the plane, its shadow stretching long across the sand. For the first time in months, she didn't feel powerless. She felt chosen, and as she locked the door behind her, unaware of the eyes watching from the ridge beyond the fence, a single truth settled quietly in her chest. This was no ordinary purchase. This was a beginning. The sun was already bleeding into the horizon when Elena returned to the airfield the next morning. The desert had a way of erasing footprints overnight, every trace of her visit swallowed by wind and dust. Yet as she drove through the rusted gates again, she felt the same pull, the same unspoken gravity that had drawn her there in the first place. The airfield stood silent, a forgotten monument to flight and failure. Rows of abandoned aircraft glimmered faintly under the morning haze, their aluminum shells reflecting pale streaks of light. Some had lost their wings entirely, lying like broken bones against the sand. Others towered with strange dignity, their shadows stretching over decades of silence. Elena parked her car near the hangar and stepped out, shielding her eyes from the glare. The desert heat rose in soft waves, distorting the air until even reality seemed to waver. The caretaker's shack sat quiet in the distance, its door half open, the wind pushing it back and forth with a hollow creak. She hesitated before walking toward the cargo plane. In daylight, it looked even larger, its faded gray body shimmering like a ghost ship stranded on land. Every dent and scar told a story she could only guess at. Inside, the air was cool and dense, carrying the smell of oxidized metal and dust that had settled like time itself. The folder she had found the day before still lay where she left it, its pages waiting like a voice from the past. She climbed down the narrow steps into the cargo hold. The sound of her boots echoed through the hollow space. Rows of rivets lined the walls like constellations, catching the stray beams of sunlight filtering through cracked panels. And then she saw them, steel crates, at least a dozen of them lined up perfectly, each stamped with serial numbers and faded warnings. Her breath caught in her throat. Yesterday, she'd barely glanced at them in the dim light, assuming they were just leftover cargo. But now, standing before them, she felt something deeper, like the air itself was watching her. She knelt beside the nearest crate, brushing away layers of dust. The label was barely legible, but one line remained clear enough to read: USAF Restricted Transport, 1968, a date. The same year as the folder, her fingers trembled as she traced the stencil. What were these doing here? Why hadn't anyone reclaimed them? The caretaker had said the plane was stripped for parts, mostly. Maybe this was the part no one wanted to claim. The sound of metal clinking behind her made her turn sharply. The wind had rattled a loose chain, swinging it slowly against the wall. She exhaled, trying to steady her heart. Then she saw something scratched faintly into the metal floor near the crates. A series of letters and numbers, carved by hand. It read, FL9X77, never delivered. Elena's stomach tightened, never delivered. The words pressed against her chest like a weight. She reached for her phone to take a photo, but there was no signal out here, no service, no connection to the world she'd come from. Silence filled the space again. The kind of silence that didn't feel empty. It felt aware. She rose slowly, her mind spinning with possibilities. Maybe these crates were filled with spare parts. Maybe they held something harmless, tools, wires, supplies. But the thought didn't sit right. The care in their alignment, the secrecy in their markings, it all whispered of something hidden, something valuable, or something dangerous. She left the hold and stepped out into the light again, blinking against the glare. The caretaker was nowhere to be seen, but she felt watched. The air carried that heavy stillness, the kind that settles before a storm when everything holds its breath. As she walked toward her car, she glanced back once more at the towering cargo plane. It stood unmoving, silent, its great frame glinting faintly in the desert sun. But in her heart, she knew one truth was already beginning to take shape. That plane wasn't empty, and whatever it carried, whatever story it buried in metal and dust, was waiting for her to uncover it. As the wind rose again, swirling around her ankles, Elena Cruz turned toward the horizon. She would return tonight, under cover of darkness, when no one could see what she was about to do. Night crept over the desert like a slow tide of shadow. The last streaks of sunlight bled into the sand until everything became the same shade of silence. Elena's headlights cut through the emptiness, tracing a narrow path back to the forgotten airfield. Her heartbeat matched the rhythm of the tires over gravel. Eddy, hesitant, unstoppable. The world around her felt suspended, caught between memory and dream. Each mile deeper into that wasteland felt like crossing a threshold she could never return from. But something inside her burned too fiercely to stop. The same quiet defiance that had kept her alive when the world tried to forget her. When she reached the fence, she killed the engine. The air was cold now, sharp against her skin. She moved carefully, flashlight in hand, the beam slicing through the dark like a blade. The hangar loomed ahead, a black silhouette against the faint shimmer of stars. The desert was never truly silent. The wind whispered through the broken wings of old aircraft. Rusted metal creaked in slow rhythm. Somewhere far off, a coyote cried, a lonely, echoing sound that made the night feel alive. She stepped inside the cargo plane again. Her light swept across the interior, painting long shadows on the walls. The air was cooler here, the smell of oil and dust stronger, almost metallic on her tongue. The crates waited where she had left them, unmoving, patient, and unreadable. She set down her bag, pulled out a small crowbar, and took a deep breath. Just one, she whispered, her voice trembling, just to see. The first strike rang out like a gunshot in the silence. The lid resisted, groaning against decades of rust. She hit it again, harder this time. A sharp crack split through the air, and the metal hinge gave way. Inside, wrapped in gray tarps, were long bars stacked tightly in rows. She pulled one free. It was heavy, cold, and shining faintly even in the weak beam of her flashlight. She brushed the surface with her sleeve, revealing a mirrored gleam beneath the dust. Silver, pure, uncorrupted, untouched. Her breath caught. Her knees weakened. She stared at the bar in disbelief, as though her mind refused to accept what her hands were holding. There was no mistaking it. It wasn't aluminum. It wasn't scrap. It was real silver. Dozens, maybe hundreds of bars. Her thoughts spiraled. How much could this be worth? Thousands, millions. Her mind raced with the math, the disbelief, the dizzying realization that her life, her son's life, might never be the same again. But then, beneath the awe came the unease. The crates weren't random. They were labeled, sealed, hidden. This wasn't treasure meant to be found. Someone had left it here for a reason. Her flashlight flickered. A sudden metallic sound echoed through the hull. Something shifting in the dark. She froze, every muscle tightening. "Hello," she whispered. No answer, just the faint sound of wind pressing against the fuselage. She moved slowly, her light darting from one corner to another, searching. Nothing moved. Yet the air felt heavier, charged, as though she had awoken something that had been sleeping for years. She turned back to the silver bar, its glow almost too bright under the trembling beam of her light. The weight of it in her hand felt dangerous, like holding a secret too big for one person. She wrapped it again, tucked it back beneath the tarp, and forced the crate closed as best she could. Her heart refused to slow. Every instinct screamed to leave, but another voice whispered louder, "Don't stop now." She took one last look around the plain before stepping out. The desert stretched endlessly before her, bathed in pale moonlight. The horizon glimmered faintly, silver against the sand, like the earth itself was reflecting her discovery. As she locked the door behind her, a thought echoed quietly in her mind. This plain wasn't abandoned by accident. It was hidden. She didn't know who had buried it here, or why, but one truth had already taken hold inside her, the kind of truth that changes everything once you've seen it. She got into her car, started the engine, and looked once more toward the massive shadow of the cargo plane. The wind swept across its wings, carrying the faint sound of metal creaking, almost like a sigh. Elena Cruz didn't know it yet, but that night she had stolen a glance into history's most dangerous secret. And as she drove away into the desert, headlights fading into darkness, the silver inside the plane gleamed quietly under the moon, waiting for the world to come looking for it. The night after the discovery refused to let Elena rest. Sleep came in fragments, torn by flashes of silver and the echo of cracking metal. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the gleam again, the impossible brightness buried in that crate, the way it caught the light like a secret screaming to be heard. By dawn she gave up trying. The air in her apartment felt too small, too still. Her son stirred in his sleep, his small hand clutching the edge of a worn blanket. Elena brushed a stray curl from his forehead and whispered, "Just a little longer, baby. I'm doing this for us." She packed her bag quietly, her movements slow and deliberate, as if too much noise might wake the truth she was trying to keep contained. The silver bar had haunted her thoughts all night, shimmering behind her eyelids like an unanswered question. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the why. Why was it there? Why was it hidden? And what had happened to the people who left it behind? By the time she reached the airfield again, the sky had turned a hazy gold. The sun burned low over the desert, casting long shadows that stretched across the rusted skeletons of forgotten plains. The cargo ship waited exactly as she'd left it, silent, monumental, and unbothered by time. Elena parked close and turned off the engine, her pulse quickening with each step toward the fuselage. The air was sharper today, the kind of dry heat that clung to her lungs. She could taste the metal in it, could feel the weight of the desert pressing down, ancient and patient. Inside, the light was different. The morning sun seeped through cracks in the hull, turning the dust into floating gold. She climbed the steps and paused, her eyes adjusting to the dim. For a long moment, all she heard was the steady rhythm of her own breathing, echoing softly in the hollow space. She moved toward the crates again, her flashlight flicking to life even though daylight already touched the metal. She knelt where she had been the night before, brushing the dust off the same crate lid, half expecting the silver to have vanished, as if it had only existed in her exhaustion. But it was there, unchanged, glimmering faintly beneath the tarp. The sight both comforted and terrified her. This time she searched more carefully. She noticed faint writing stenciled along the side of another crate, "Property of U.S. Treasury, Trans. It authorization denied." The letters were faded but clear enough to make her throat go dry. Treasury, denied. These weren't just forgotten supplies. They were something that was never supposed to leave government hands. She moved through the cargo hold slowly, shining her light into corners, stepping over old cables and tools. Near the back, her foot caught on something. A metal latch bolted into the floor. She crouched down and pried at it until a hidden compartment gave way with a sharp click. Inside was a small lockbox, heavy and coated in grime. Her fingers trembled as she forced it open. Inside, wrapped in wax paper, were faded photographs, black and white. Men in uniform standing in front of the very same plane, its insignia fresh, its wings unscarred. One of them held a clipboard labeled Manifest 9X77. Another photo showed the crates being loaded by soldiers wearing no identifiable patches. And behind them, in faint letters across a hangar wall, the word Silverlight. Elena's heart thudded painfully. Operation Silverlight, the name from the folder in the cockpit. It wasn't just some bureaucratic code. It was real, living history frozen in her hands. She spread the photos on the floor, tracing each face with her eyes. Every man looked proud, unaware that decades later, their mission would rust away in silence. A shadow moved across the light behind her. She turned sharply, heart pounding, but no one was there. Still, the air felt different now. Heavy, observant, she gathered the photos, placed them back inside the box, and shut it tight. The rational part of her screamed to stop, to leave, to tell someone, anyone, but another part, deeper and older, refused to let go. This was no longer about desperation. It was about truth. She climbed into the cockpit again, brushing dust off the instrument panel. The folder marked Operation Silverlight still sat where she had left it. She flipped through the brittle pages, finding logs of dates and destinations, all redacted except one, June 9, 1968, final cargo secured classified. Her finger hovered over the words, final cargo. She leaned back in the pilot's seat, the cracked leather sighing beneath her weight. Outside, the desert shimmered in the heat, endless and empty. Yet deep in her chest, a quiet realization formed. This plane hadn't just carried metal. It had carried something far heavier. Secrets, guilt, and maybe betrayal. She didn't hear the sound of footsteps outside, faint against the sand. Didn't see the distant figure watching from the ridge, a camera glinting once under the sun before disappearing into the wind. Elena Cruz was not alone anymore, and as she traced her hand over the old flight log, the past she had uncovered began to breathe again, lowly, quietly, waiting for her next move. The wind had picked up by late afternoon, sweeping through the desert with a sound like whispers through teeth. Dust spun in pale spirals around the hangar as the last light began to fade, painting the plane in copper and shadow. Elena stood just outside the cargo door, the small lockbox of photographs clutched to her chest. The edges of the metal bit into her palms, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts were loud, too loud, turning over every question, every possible danger that now surrounded her. If those photos were real, then she wasn't holding scraps of history. She was standing in the middle of it. Something had been hidden here on purpose, and she had just torn open the lid. She climbed back into the plane one last time before the light disappeared completely. Her flashlight beam cut through the gloom, catching on wires, the empty pilot seats, the crates lined like tombstones. The silence pressed down harder than before, almost humming beneath the surface. The sound of metal shifting made her pause. It came from behind the bulkhead, faint but deliberate, as though something, or someone, had moved. Her pulse spiked. She turned sharply, shining the light toward the noise, but there was nothing. Only the slow, echoing tick of the cooling metal. Her breath caught. She tried to tell herself it was just the wind. The structure was old, it groaned and settled like a living thing, but unease crawled up her spine all the same. When she turned back toward the cockpit, her flashlight flickered. Once, twice, then steadied. A small shape caught her eye near the pilot's seat, a rusted tag hanging from the control lever. It must have been hidden beneath the dust. She brushed it clean. Stamped letters appeared. Property of Flight 9X77, do not reassign. Flight 9X77, the same code scratched into the floor by the crates. Her throat went dry. This wasn't just the plane's registration. It was its identity. The one that had never been delivered. She sat in the pilot's chair again, gripping the logbook tighter. The name Operation Silverlight burned behind her eyes. Every page she turned felt heavier than the last. The handwriting changed halfway through the book. Different pen pressure, uneven strokes. Someone else had taken over the log in its final entries. The last line was written in ink that had bled with time. Payload secure. Rendezvous failed. Awaiting extraction. She whispered the words aloud, barely breathing them. Awaiting extraction. A chill moved through her despite the heat. The plane hadn't been abandoned. It had been left. Left waiting for someone who never came. She closed the book slowly, the realization sinking in like sand filling a grave. Whatever was inside those crates wasn't meant to reach its destination. Maybe the operation had gone wrong. Maybe the men in those photos had vanished with it. Outside, the wind slammed the cargo door shut with a sharp clang that echoed like a gunshot. She flinched, her heart leaping to her throat. When she ran to the door, it wouldn't budge. The latch had jammed from the impact. Panic clawed at her chest as she tugged again and again until it finally gave way with a harsh metallic crack. She stumbled out into the open air, gasping. The desert had already fallen into shadow, the horizon glowing faintly where the sun had fled. That was when she saw the tire marks, fresh ones, deep in the sand near the fence line. Someone else had been here. She crouched beside them, tracing the pattern with her fingers. Not from her car. These were larger, heavier. A truck, maybe, and from the direction of the tracks, whoever it was hadn't left. They'd driven closer, watched. Elena's breath came shallow and quick. The caretaker's warning replayed in her head. Some things are better left sealed. She looked back at the plane, its shadow stretching long across the dunes, its body glinting faintly under the rising moon. It no longer looked like a derelict machine. It looked like a trap. She got into her car and started the engine. The headlights flared against the dust, lighting up the chain link fence ahead. For a moment she thought she saw movement near the edge of the field. A flicker of a shape, the glint of glass, maybe binoculars catching her beam. Then it was gone. She floored the accelerator, heart hammering as she tore through the gate and back onto the dirt road. The silver box of photographs sat on the passenger seat beside her, its weight feeling almost alive. Every few seconds, she glanced in the mirror, half expecting headlights to appear. But the desert behind her remained black and endless. When she reached the main road, she finally exhaled, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles burned white. The thought she tried to ignore all day now refused to stay quiet. Someone knew. Someone was guarding that plane, even after all these years. She didn't know who they were, or what they wanted, but she understood one thing clearly now. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. As the desert wind howled around her car and the stars began to bloom across the sky, Elena Cruz realized that whatever was hidden inside that aircraft wasn't just valuable. It was dangerous, and somewhere in the darkness behind her, the watchers of Flight 9X77 were already awake. The next morning rose in shades of pale gold, but for Elena the light brought no comfort. The world outside her window felt quieter than usual, too quiet, like the pause before a siren. She hadn't slept more than an hour. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the plane, the crates, the word Silverlight. burned into her thoughts like a brand. She made coffee just to hold something warm in her hands, but it did nothing to stop the tremor in her fingers. Matteo was still asleep in the next room, his small, steady breathing a fragile reminder of why she couldn't stop now. Whatever was buried in that aircraft wasn't just metal. It was truth, and somehow she knew it was tangled with her fate now. On the table lay the lockbox she'd brought home. The photos had been spread out overnight, studied, rearranged, memorized. The men in uniform, the loading ramp, the faces blurred by time. And at the center of one photo, barely visible but unmistakable, was the same caretaker she'd met at the airfield. Younger, standing near the plane, clipboard in hand, her pulse slowed. He wasn't just a watchman. He had been there. By noon, she was back on the road, driving toward the nearest town. The world outside the city always felt older here, the buildings sun, bleached and tired. She parked outside a narrow bookstore that doubled as a historical archive, its window cluttered with yellowed maps and military postcards. The bell above the door chimed as she stepped inside, the cool air smelling faintly of old paper and dust. A man sat behind the counter, his white beard resting against a worn sweater, glasses sliding halfway down his nose. He looked up as she entered, studying her like someone who'd already seen too much of life. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked. "I hope so," she said softly, setting the folder marked Operation Silverlight on the counter. "I'm looking for anything on this. It's old, maybe Cold War era, maybe something classified." He raised an eyebrow, the curiosity breaking through his calm. "That's not a name I've heard in years." Her heart jumped. "So it's real?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured toward the back of the shop, where narrow aisles led into a small reading room. "Come with me." They sat at a table littered with files and maps. The historian moved slowly, pulling a leather-bound ledger from a high shelf. His voice was quiet when he spoke. Operation Silverlight wasn't officially recorded, but there were whispers, rumors about shipments of precious metals moved off the books during the late 60s. Supposedly, they were to fund covert missions overseas, the kind that never made it into the news. Elena leaned forward, her chest tight. "What happened to them?" He closed the ledger, exhaling heavily. "One transport vanished, a cargo plane out of Nevada. They said it went down over the desert, but no wreckage was ever reported. People stopped asking questions." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Flight 9X-77. The old man froze, eyes narrowing behind his glasses. "How do you know that designation?" Elena hesitated, glancing toward the front of the shop. "Because I found it. The plane. It's still there." The silence that followed was thick and heavy, like the air itself had stopped moving. The historian's face went pale. He looked at her not with disbelief, but with fear. "You need to be careful," he said finally. "If that plane's still intact, someone knows. Those shipments weren't abandoned. They were buried. And if you found them, you've just unearthed something people have spent decades trying to keep dead." Elena swallowed hard. "I didn't mean to, I know," he interrupted, "but it doesn't matter now. You've already stepped into the story." He reached into his desk and handed her a slip of paper, a number scribbled in hurried ink. "If you find anything else, call me. But for God's sake, don't tell anyone else. Not the press, not the police. They'll take it, and you'll disappear with it." The words hit her like a blow. She wanted to argue, to demand an explanation, but his expression silenced her. This wasn't curiosity in his eyes, it was experience. As she stepped back out into the sunlight, the warmth felt foreign, unreal. The small slip of paper in her pocket felt heavier than it should. She walked to her car, scanning the quiet street. An unmarked black SUV sat parked across from the bookstore. Its windows were tinted too dark to see inside. She hesitated for a moment before climbing into her own car, forcing herself not to look again. When she started the engine, the SUV brake lights flared. She pulled away from the curb, her pulse pounding in her throat. The vehicle didn't follow, but the unease stayed. Every mirror, every shadow, every turn felt like eyes on her. By the time she reached the edge of town, the sun was sinking behind the mountains, setting the sky on fire. The road ahead shimmered like molten glass. Somewhere far behind her, the world she knew was closing its doors. Ahead, the truth waited, buried beneath steel and silence. Elena Cruz gripped the wheel tighter, her heart steadying into resolve. She had gone too far to stop now, and as the desert swallowed her car once more, the first faint hum of danger rose beneath the wind, soft, steady, and relentless, like the heartbeat of the past awakening again. The desert was colder that night. The air no longer carried the warmth of the day, only the low hiss of sand shifting under a pale moon. Elena parked her car just beyond the airfield fence, headlights off, her heart thudding in the quiet. The conversation with the historian replayed in her head like an echo she couldn't silence. They weren't abandoned. They were buried, hidden, protected. She stepped out of the car and felt the stillness immediately. The kind of silence that comes when even the wind refuses to move. The plane stood in the distance, bathed in ghostly light, its frame glinting like the skeleton of something long extinct. Each step toward it felt heavier than the last. She carried her flashlight low, its beam cutting through the sand in narrow streaks. She could almost feel the weight of unseen eyes following her again. Whether from the ridges beyond the fence or from the plane itself, she didn't know. Inside, the air was colder than before. The faint smell of oil and dust mixed with something else now, metallic, sharp, unsettling. The crates waited in the dim, their outlines glowing faintly under the thin spill of moonlight from a crack in the fuselage. She climbed into the cockpit again. Her hands brushed the controls, worn smooth by years of forgotten use. The folder marked Operation Silverlight lay open across her lap. She read the same page again and again, but her mind refused to make sense of the coded language and redacted lines. Then she saw it, a single page she hadn't noticed before, tucked behind the log sheets, smaller, typed on different paper. It wasn't a record, it was a letter. To command, Silverlight transport has been compromised. Do not recover. Repeat, do not recover. Containment protocol active. All remaining cargo secured aboard 9X-77. Ground team to seal site upon confirmation. Authorized, Cole J. Mercer. Her breath caught. Do not recover. The words twisted in her gut. Whatever was inside those crates wasn't just valuable. It was forbidden, and someone named Mercer had ordered it to stay buried forever. Her flashlight flickered again, the beam catching the glint of something new barely visible beneath the co-pilot's seat. She crouched, pulling out a metal canister the size of her hand, stamped with the same faded insignia as the crates. It rattled when she shook it lightly, the sound of loose film reels inside. Heart racing, she popped the lid open. Inside were several old microfilm rolls, tightly wound and labeled with numbers she didn't understand. She slipped one into her pocket, replaced the rest, and sealed the canister again. Outside, a sound broke the silence, a faint crunch of gravel. Elena froze. She killed the flashlight and crouched low. The noise came again, closer this time. Someone was walking near the plane, slow, careful, the faint metallic echo of boots against the hull. Her throat tightened. She held her breath and pressed her back against the cold wall. Through a narrow crack in the metal, she saw movement, shadows sliding across the sand. Two figures. One carried a flashlight, sweeping it methodically across the ground. The beam caught her car in the distance, lingered on it, then shifted back toward the plane. She moved silently toward the cargo hold, careful not to make a sound. The old metal creaked beneath her, every noise amplified in her chest. "Check the cockpit," a voice said outside, low, firm, unmistakably military. Her pulse exploded. She ducked behind a crate, crouching low. The door groaned open, spilling light into the darkness. A silhouette filled the entrance, tall and rigid, the outline of a gun visible against the beam. "She's been here," the second voice said. "Tracks are fresh. Then she knows." The man's tone was sharp, cold. Elena's fingers brushed the lockbox near her feet, the one holding the photographs. She slipped it silently into her backpack, her movements slow and steady. Every second felt like a lifetime. The first man stepped deeper into the plane, scanning the walls. "If she took the documents, we're out of time. Mercer's protocol ends here. You know what that means." "Cleanup?" the other asked. "Complete." She didn't need to hear more. As the beam turned away for a moment, Elena bolted toward the rear exit, her steps muffled by layers of dust and sand. She leapt out of the plane and hit the ground hard, rolling once before sprinting toward the fence. The sound of shouts followed, the clatter of boots against metal. She didn't look back. Her lungs burned, her vision blurred, but adrenaline carried her forward. The car was less than 100 feet away. She threw herself inside, jammed the key into the ignition, and the engine roared to life. Headlights flared across the desert just as the two men burst from the plane's shadow. A gunshot split the night, sharp, deafening. A bullet struck the sand beside her tire, spraying dust against the door. She hit the gas, the wheels spinning before catching traction, throwing up a storm of grit as she sped toward the open road. The rearview mirror flashed with light, headlamps chasing her across the dunes. Her heart thundered in rhythm with the engine. The microfilm in her pocket pressed cold against her thigh. The historian's words echoed in her mind, "They'll take it, and you'll disappear with it." Elena Cruz drove faster than she ever had before, the black sky streaking overhead like a closing curtain. Whatever Operation Silverlight truly was, she had just stolen its pulse from the heart of its grave. And now, the ghosts of those who buried it were coming to reclaim what was never meant to be found. The following morning broke not with peace, but with the kind of uneasy quiet that comes after a storm that hasn't truly ended. Elena sat in a car on the edge of town, parked beneath a flickering motel sign that buzzed in tired intervals. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel, her heartbeat still echoing from the chase through the desert. She hadn't dared drive home. Whoever those men were, they had followed her once. They could follow her again. The sky was gray now, clouds gathering over the horizon like bruises. She could feel the coming rain pressing down on the air, heavy and electric. Her mind wouldn't stop spinning. Those voices in the hangar, the mention of Mercer, the threat of cleanup. The word still made her shiver. They hadn't been thieves. They had been operatives, men trained to erase mistakes. And last night, she had become one of those mistakes. She looked at herself in the rear-view mirror. Dust lined her face. There was a small cut across her cheek she hadn't noticed until now, dried blood tracing her jaw. Her eyes looked older, harder. She pulled the microfilm from her pocket. The small black reel gleamed faintly under the weak light filtering through the windshield. Something about it felt wrong, too deliberate, too important to have survived all these years by accident. Whatever it contained was dangerous enough for men with guns to kill for it. She needed help, but not from the police. If this was military, the chain of command would only loop back to the same people hunting her. That left only one name. She unfolded the slip of paper the historian had given her, the ink now smudged from her sweat. He had said, "If you find anything, call me." Her fingers hovered over the phone. 1,000 doubts pressed against her chest, but fear left no space for hesitation. She dialed. The line rang once, twice. Then a voice, quiet, controlled, too calm to be surprised. "Elena," he said, "you found more." She exhaled shakily. "They were there, 2 men. They knew about the plane. They were looking for me." A pause. "Did they see you?" "Yes." Another pause. She could almost hear the weight settle on the other end. "Then you're running out of time." "I found something inside," she said. "Film reels, documents, a name. Mercer, do you know it?" The man's breath hitched, barely audible. "Colonel Jonathan Mercer. He led several covert funding programs between 1966 and 1971, all of them off record. If you have his name attached to Silverlight, you have something far beyond stolen silver. You have proof." "Proof of what?" She pressed. "That the money never went to operations. It went to people, officials, corporations, everyone who built their empires during the Cold War on blood and silence. And if that evidence survived, it would burn careers that were never supposed to end." Elena's throat tightened. "So they're still protecting it." "They always protect what still profits them," he said. "Listen carefully. There are safe places you can hide, but none will last long. You need to make copies of whatever's on that film before it's taken." Her eyes flicked toward the mirror. A black sedan turned into the parking lot behind her, moving slow. "Someone's here," she whispered. "Then leave now," the historian said, his tone sharp, urgent. "Don't go back to the airfield, don't go home. Drive somewhere public, somewhere you can disappear in a crowd. And Elena." "What?" "If you're holding that film, they'll find you eventually, but if you release what's on it, you become untouchable. You'll stop being prey and start being a problem." The line went dead. Elena didn't wait to question him. She shoved the phone into her bag and started the car. The engine roared to life just as the sedan parked 3 spaces away. Its windows were tinted black, the same kind she'd seen near the bookstore. She reversed fast, tires screeching, and pulled onto the road. The car followed. Her pulse quickened. Every light, every turn became a test. She took back streets, narrow lanes, then veered toward the industrial outskirts of town where old factories stood like hollow skeletons. Rain began to fall, the first drops hitting the windshield like warning knocks. In the distance, thunder rolled low and long. She finally pulled into the back of an abandoned service station and cut the engine. Her chest heaved with shallow breaths as she watched through the mirrors. The sedan didn't pass by. It had stopped somewhere behind her, just out of sight. She slipped out quietly, clutching her backpack. The microfilm rattled inside like a heartbeat. The rain grew heavier, masking her footsteps as she crept through the side entrance of the station. The smell of rust and oil filled the air. Every shadow looked like a threat now. She crouched behind an old compressor, the cold metal pressing against her back. Her hands were shaking, not from fear alone, but from realization. She wasn't just running from debt or desperation anymore. She was running from history itself. The sound of a door opening echoed across the concrete. A flashlight beam swept the floor, then another. Boots followed, slow and methodical. Elena held her breath. The microfilm pressed against her ribs as if trying to remind her it existed. She thought of Matteo, his small hands, his laughter, the way he slept with his favorite blanket tucked under his chin. For the first time, she wasn't sure she'd see him again. But she also knew something unshakable. If she didn't fight, he'd grow up in the same world built on lies like this one. The men's footsteps drew closer. Their voices were faint, muffled by the rain. "She's here," one said. Elena's eyes darted toward the exit door, a thin rectangle of pale light cutting through the dark, and in that moment she made a choice. She wasn't going to run anymore, not from them. Not from the truth. She tightened her grip on the bag and waited for the right moment, every muscle coiled like wire. Outside, thunder cracked hard across the sky. The flash lit the station for a split second, long enough to see the glint of a gun. The next second she moved. The thunder still echoed when Elena broke into motion, the flash of lightning painting her silhouette across the cracked walls. She sprinted for the side exit, boots slapping against wet concrete. The men shouted, their voices sharp and commanding, years of authority condensed into one brutal order. Stop, don't move. The rain swallowed their words. Elena burst through the door and into the downpour. The night hit her like a wave, cold, alive, electric. The service station's floodlight flickered weakly, throwing long shadows over the lot as she ran toward the narrow alley behind the building. Water streamed down her face, mixing with the grit and blood that clung to her skin. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The sound of pursuit followed, boots striking puddles, the sharp crack of a gunshot splitting the storm. A bullet tore through a rusted barrel beside her, the impact ringing out like metal thunder. Shards flew past her shoulder, cutting her sleeve. She stumbled, caught herself, and kept running. Every instinct screamed to hide, to disappear, but something stronger drove her forward. The weight of that microfilm pressed against her chest like a promise. If she escaped tonight, she could end this. She could expose everything. She reached the far end of the alley and dove behind a row of old dumpsters. Her breath came in short, shaking bursts. The men's voices grew nearer, carried by the rain. She went this way, fan out. Elena pressed her back to the wall, her heartbeat hammering so loud she thought it might give her away. The rain blurred everything, their outlines, the sound, even time itself. She waited, counting their footsteps, one to the left, one closer. The smell of wet asphalt filled her lungs. A sudden flash of light swept over her hiding spot. She froze. The beam lingered for a breath, then moved on. When the footsteps faded, she slipped into the shadows and ran again, quieter this time, her body moving on pure instinct. The alley opened into an empty street that stretched toward the edge of town. A neon diner sign flickered faintly in the distance, promising the illusion of safety. She made it inside moments later, drenched, trembling, the bell over the door chiming weakly. The place was nearly empty, just 2 truckers at the counter and a waitress with tired eyes wiping down tables. Elena slid into a booth near the back, her wet clothes sticking to the seat. Her breath came in shallow waves as she looked around. No one seemed to notice her, not yet. The waitress approached, offering a polite smile. "Rough night," Elena nodded, forcing a faint laugh. "Yeah, you could say that. Coffee, please." The waitress walked away. The sound of the rain against the windows filled the silence, steady and rhythmic. For a fleeting moment, Elena almost felt invisible again, like the world had paused to let her catch her breath. Then her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You can't hide what's already marked." Her stomach twisted. The letters blurred for a moment, then refocused, colder than before. She turned the screen off and stared through the rain-streaked glass. Across the street, a black SUV idled beneath the flickering streetlight. The waitress returned with the coffee. Elena's hands shook as she reached for the cup. The woman frowned. "You okay, honey?" Elena managed a nod, though her throat had gone dry. "Just tired." The SUV door opened. Her mind raced. She couldn't run again. Not here. Too public. Too many witnesses. But maybe that was the point. If they couldn't take her quietly, they wouldn't take her at all. She stood, leaving a few crumpled bills on the table, and walked toward the back of the diner. There was a small hallway leading to the restrooms and a side exit marked employees only. She slipped through, moving past boxes of supplies and shelves stacked with cleaning bottles. The metal door at the end groaned open, and the cold rain hit her face once more. She moved fast, crossing behind the diner toward the gas station next door. A flickering fluorescent sign cast a dull glow over the wet pavement. As she ducked beneath the overhang, she saw her reflection in the glass door, soaked, frightened, but defiant. Inside, a lone customer stood at the counter paying for cigarettes. The clerk barely looked up. Elena made her way to the restroom and locked the door behind her. Her hands shook as she pulled the microfilm from her bag. She stared at it under the flickering light, water still dripping from her hair. "You'll stop being prey and start being a problem." She exhaled and slipped the reel into a waterproof pouch, then tucked it beneath the loose tile behind the toilet. She pressed the tile back in place, sealing it perfectly. If they caught her tonight, they wouldn't find it. When she stepped back out, the store was quiet. Too quiet. The man who'd been buying cigarettes was gone. So was the SUV outside. For a brief, fragile moment, the world felt still again. Elena walked to the payphone by the door and lifted the receiver. She dialed the historian's number from memory. It rang once, twice, then cut off. No answer. Lightning flashed outside, followed by the deep growl of thunder. In the reflection of the glass, she caught a glimpse of something behind her. 2 figures stepping through the door. Her pulse surged. The taller one raised a hand, his voice calm but commanding. "Elena Cruz." She turned slowly, her expression unreadable beneath the dim light. "You're in possession of classified material," he said. "Hand it over, and this ends quietly." She took a step back. "You mean like it ended for the crew of that plane?" The man's eyes narrowed. "You shouldn't know about that." "Well," she said softly, her voice trembling but steady, "you shouldn't have left it behind." For a second, no one moved. The rain outside pounded harder, the sound filling every corner of the silence. Then, with a sharp motion, Elena threw the coffee mug from the counter straight at the light fixture. It shattered, plunging the room into near darkness. She ran, the agent shouted, the door slammed open, and the storm swallowed her once more. The rain soaked her hair, blinded her vision, but she didn't stop. Not until the road opened ahead and the sound of engines rose behind her like an oncoming wave. She was no longer running for survival. She was running for the truth, and by dawn the world would know her name. Dawn came pale and silent, a fragile light struggling through the low fog that blanketed the horizon. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed and hollow. Elena sat in the driver's seat of her car, parked on a cliff overlooking the desert, the early sun catching in her eyes. Her clothes were still damp, her skin raw from rain and fear, but her mind had sharpened into something clear and unyielding. She had hidden the film, she had survived the night, but survival no longer felt like enough. Her reflection stared back at her from the rear-view mirror. Eyes bloodshot, lips chapped, determination carved deep into every line of her face. She had been running from ghosts and guns, but now she knew what she carried wasn't just evidence. It was power. The kind that could destroy those who had buried the truth and rebuild everything they'd built on lies. For the first time, she didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a witness. The radio crackled faintly in the background, just static, until a voice cut through. A local broadcast, monotone and sleepy, reports of an incident near the Mojave airfield. No details, no names, no mention of her, but she knew they had gone back. They were covering the wreckage, cleaning the trail she'd left behind. Her stomach tightened. If they were burying it again, she had to bring it to light first. She reached for her phone, scrolling through contacts until she stopped on one name she'd saved weeks ago and almost forgotten. Daniel Reyes, investigative journalist. They'd met briefly at a charity drive where she'd once worked. He had handed her his card with a half's, smile, and said, "If you ever stumble onto something real, call me." Elena took a deep breath and pressed call. It rang 3 times before a groggy voice answered. "Hello, Daniel, it's Elena Cruz," she said quickly, glancing at the road behind her. "I need to meet you. It's about something big, military, government, maybe Cold War, and it's not conspiracy junk, it's real." There was a pause on the line, a soft rustle as he sat up. "Elena, from the outreach center, you sound. Jesus, are you okay?" "No," she said, her voice trembling between fear and focus. "But I will be. I just need someone who can help me make people see the truth before they make me disappear." He hesitated. "Where are you?" She looked out at the desert, the emptiness stretching forever, halfway between Ridgefield and the old Mojave Road. "I can meet you at the diner there, 1 hour. I'll be there." The line went dead, but this time she felt a strange kind of comfort in the silence that followed. For the first time since the storm began, she wasn't alone in this. An hour later, the diner's neon sign buzzed faintly as she pulled into the lot. The sun had burned away the last of the mist, revealing a sky so blue it almost mocked her exhaustion. Daniel was already there, sitting in a corner booth by the window. He looked up when she entered, all disheveled, with the kind of face that belonged to someone who had seen too many lies to believe anything easily. "Elena," he said softly as she slid into the booth, "you look like you've been through a war." "I have," she said. "I just didn't know which one." He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Tell me everything." She told him, every detail. The auction, the airfield, the crates, the men, the film, the name Mercer. As she spoke, his skepticism melted into fascination, then horror. He didn't interrupt. When she finally stopped, her coffee had gone cold. Daniel exhaled slowly. "You understand what this means, right? If what's on that film is what I think it is, it's not just stolen silver. It's evidence of the biggest covert laundering program in U.S. history, money that never existed, used to build power that still does." Elena nodded. "And they're still protecting it. They killed for it." He looked out the window, his jaw tightening. "Then we'll give them something they can't kill, a story too loud to silence." She met his gaze, hope flickering somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. "You'll help me," he nodded once, "but we'll have to be careful. We'll need proof, copies, verifications, and we can't do it here. They'll trace you, maybe me too. I know someone who can process the film quietly, an archivist I trust, off the record." Elena hesitated. "If we do this, there's no going back." Daniel gave a grim smile. "You already crossed that line the moment you opened that crate." The waitress passed by, refilling their cups without a word. Outside, a wind kicked up, stirring the dust into slow spirals. For a moment, Elena let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she could still control how this ended. But as she reached for her coffee, a flash of movement outside the window froze her hand midair. Across the street, a black SUV had pulled into the lot. Daniel saw it too. "They found you," he murmured. Elena's pulse spiked. "How doesn't matter. We have to move." He reached into his jacket and tossed a set of keys onto the table. "Take my car. I'll stall them." "Daniel, no. Go." The sound of a door slamming outside cut her protest short. The SUV doors opened, and 2 men in suits stepped out. Elena grabbed the keys, heart pounding, and slipped through the side door into the alley. The heat hit her like a wall. Behind her, she heard voices sharp, professional, closing in. Daniel's voice rose once, calm but firm, buying her seconds. She ran, turning corners blindly, until she reached the parking lot where his car waited. She threw the bag into the passenger seat and started the engine. The tires squealed as she tore down the road, the desert stretching endlessly ahead. In her rearview mirror, she saw the diner shrinking into the distance. and Daniel, standing alone at the window, facing the men who had come for her. For a moment, guilt almost pulled her back. But then she remembered his words, "We'll give them something they can't kill." She gripped the wheel tighter, her voice trembling as she whispered into the wind, "Hold on, Daniel. I'll finish this." The horizon burned with sunlight, the road endless before her. Behind, the black SUV began to follow. And as the desert heat shimmered around her, Elena Cruz realized that truth had a cost, and she was already paying it in full. The road unfurled before Elena like a river of light, cutting through the endless desert. The sun was now high, glaring off the sand and the windshield, blinding her every few seconds. She drove fast, too fast, gripping the wheel as though letting go would send her spinning into the void. Behind her, the black SUV remained a distant shape, never close enough to strike, never far enough to forget. A dark echo of her every move. The heat outside was merciless, rising in waves that shimmered off the horizon. Inside, her pulse was louder than the hum of the engine. She could still see Daniel's face in her mind, steady, fearless, defiant. She didn't know what those men had done to him after she fled the diner, but she knew the kind of people she was dealing with now. They wouldn't negotiate, they would erase. She reached for the radio, searching for noise, anything to break the suffocating silence. But every station was static, fractured voices buried in interference. It was as if the world beyond this desert had turned its back. When she finally saw the sign for the next town, Ravenwood, population 842, a flicker of hope pushed through the exhaustion. Daniel had said he knew someone, an archivist who could process the film quietly. He hadn't given her a name, but the note scribbled inside his notebook, the one she'd grabbed in her panic, read only, Ravenwood Historical Preservation Center, ask for Mara. She didn't know if it was still there, or if Mara would even exist anymore. But it was her only chance. She drove into town as the SUV disappeared somewhere down the highway, maybe circling, maybe regrouping. Ravenwood looked like a place time had given up on old gas stations, boarded up stores, a church leaning slightly toward the road as if weary of standing. At the end of the main street stood a two-story brick building with a faded wooden sign, Ravenwood Archives and Local History. Elena parked across the street and sat for a moment, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. The air smelled of rain and dust. Every instinct told her this was a trap, that the world around her had stopped being safe long ago. But Daniel's words echoed in her mind, "Trust the truth more than your fear." She stepped out. Inside, the building was cool and dim. Rows of file cabinets stretched into the shadows. The only light came from a single desk lamp near the back, illuminating a woman with silver, streaked hair and steady, intelligent eyes. She looked up the moment Elena entered as though she'd been expecting her. "You're Elena?" she said softly. It wasn't a question. Elena froze. "How do you know my name? Daniel called me before you met him. He said if anything happened, you'd come here." Relief flooded her chest so suddenly it almost hurt. "He's alive." Mara's expression faltered for a fraction of a second. "He was when he called. That's all I know." Elena swallowed hard and reached into her bag. She pulled out the small waterproof pouch, the one she'd hidden under the tile in the gas station bathroom, retrieved before leaving town. Inside, the microfilm lay untouched, the black reels gleaming faintly in the dim light. "I need to know what's on this," she said. Mara nodded. "Then let's find out." She led Elena through a narrow hallway into a darkroom that smelled of chemicals and dust. Machines hummed faintly, mixture of ancient and modern, analog reels connected to a small digital converter. As the first roll began to spin, faint images appeared on the projection glass, documents, memos, ledgers. Elena leaned forward, her breath catching as the words came into focus. Operation Silverlight Asset Diversion Schedule. Total cargo 8000 silver bars. Destination undisclosed facility, South America. Funding allocation civil infrastructure shell accounts. She frowned. Shell accounts. Mara zoomed in, scanning the fine print. That means the money wasn't used for government projects. It was redirected through fake companies, private investments, political foundations, even defense contractors. The next reel clicked into place. More pages, more names, authorized by, Call, Jonathan Mercer, secondary beneficiary, R. Halberg Holdings, Washington, D.C. Mara's eyes widened. That's impossible. Halberg became a senator in '72. These funds, these exact accounts, helped finance his campaigns. Elena's stomach dropped. So this isn't just stolen money, it's the foundation of their power. Mara nodded grimly. You're holding proof that a secret Cold War fund became the seed money for some of the most powerful political dynasties in the country. The projector light flickered as the next reel started. This one wasn't documents. It was film footage, grainy black and white images of men loading the silver crates onto the cargo plane, the number 9X77 painted clearly along its side. Soldiers in unmarked uniforms moved with precision, their faces hidden behind masks. At the end of the reel, the camera turned briefly toward the man directing them, a tall figure in a long coat, his face half-shadowed. Mara froze the frame. There, zoom in. Elena's breath stopped. The face was older now in her memory, but unmistakable. The caretaker, the man from the desert airfield. Her hands went cold. He was part of it. He didn't warn me because he cared. He was protecting what was left. Mara stepped back, her voice low. Elena, this footage, if it's made public, it will shake the country. But if you release it without protection, they'll silence you before it sees daylight. I don't care anymore, Elena said, her voice trembling but sure. They've killed for this. Daniel might already be gone. I'm not hiding while they write the next lie. Mara studied her for a moment, then nodded. There's one way to do it safely. A journalist network, independent, encrypted, global. If we send this through them, it can't be buried. But once we press send, there's no turning back. Elena took a breath, feeling the weight of the choice settle deep in her bones. Do it. Mara inserted the final reel into the converter. The machine hummed softly, the images flickering across the screen as data transferred frame by frame. Outside, the light dimmed. The wind began to rise again, carrying the scent of rain. Then, from the front of the building, a sound, soft, deliberate, the slow creak of a door opening. Mara looked at her sharply. They found us. Elena turned toward the sound, heart pounding. The dark room filled with the distant rhythm of footsteps. Measured, unhurried, inevitable. Mara whispered, "Keep the upload running. Don't stop, no matter what happens." Elena nodded, her hands trembling as she stood between the humming machine and the door. The faint glow of the projector light painted her in silver. For a brief moment, she thought of her son, his laughter, his small hand gripping hers, and the promise she had made, "We're going to be okay." Now, standing in that flickering half-light, she understood what it truly meant. Okay didn't mean safe, it meant free. Outside, the wind howled through the empty streets, rattling the old glass panes like the breath of ghosts. And when the door finally swung open, Elena Cruz was ready to face whoever had come to finish the story she refused to let die. The door groaned open, slicing through the darkroom silence like a blade. Cold air spilled inside, carrying with it the heavy scent of rain, soaked dust. Elena's pulse thundered in her ears. The projector still whirred softly behind her, flickering shadows across the walls as the last reel continued uploading. Each second mattered now. Each frame of truth that left that machine was a bullet against the silence they'd built. Two figures stepped through the doorway. The first, tall and deliberate, was the same man she had seen in the film, the caretaker from the desert. He wasn't wearing the ragged clothes of an old watchman anymore. His posture had changed, his uniform crisp beneath a dark coat. The pretense was gone, his eyes, sharp and unblinking, locked onto her. "Miss Cruz," he said, voice low, steady, "you've caused a great deal of trouble." Elena didn't move. Her hands hovered near the edge of the projector console, fingers trembling but ready. Behind her, Mara worked quietly, pretending to check the upload progress, but really sending backup copies to multiple encrypted drives. "I only found what was already buried," Elena said. "If that's trouble, maybe you should ask why it was there in the first place." The man stepped closer. The other figure followed, a younger operative, his gun drawn but lowered, the way predators carry their teeth before they bite. The caretaker's tone was almost gentle. "You think you've uncovered corruption, but you have no idea what this operation protected. You've taken something you can't control." Elena met his gaze. "You mean something you couldn't control anymore?" His expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered. Just for a heartbeat, enough for her to know she'd struck the truth. "Those funds," he said, "were designed to stabilize nations, to ensure order when the world teetered on collapse. The kind of power that never makes headlines. You think you're a hero, but all you've done is expose the foundation that keeps your world standing. Then maybe it deserves to fall," she said. The younger man stepped forward. "Enough. Wait," the caretaker murmured. He raised a hand to stop his partner, his voice softer now, almost paternal. "Elena, listen to me. I know what it's like to want justice. I was there when we loaded that silver, when we sealed that plane. I believed in what we were told, but sometimes the truth isn't meant to be freed. It's meant to be contained, because once you open the door, there's no closing it." She shook her head, tears burning behind her eyes. "Containment is just another word for control, and you've controlled everything. Who lives, who starves, who knows the truth. I won't let you keep doing it." Behind her, Mara whispered, 5% left, almost done." The sound of those words changed everything. The caretaker's eyes narrowed. "You're transmitting it." He took a step forward. The younger operative raised his gun. Mara's trembling fingers hovered above the console. "Stop the upload," he ordered. "Now." Elena's voice came out steady, though her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. "If I do, you'll kill us anyway." The man hesitated. For the first time, his calm cracked. "You don't understand what's at stake." "Oh, I do," she said, "and that's why I'm not stopping." The gun's hammer clicked back. Mara froze. The screen behind them glowed brighter. 98%. 99%. The caretaker's hand shook slightly. "Elena, please, you have a son, don't you?" The words hit her like a knife. Her body stiffened. "Think of him," he said. "Think of what happens when powerful men feel cornered. They won't come for you, they'll come for him." The projector hummed. 100%. The screen flashed green. Upload complete. Transmission verified. A single tone echoed through the room. A soft digital heartbeat. The truth was gone, unstoppable. The caretaker saw it too late. His face hardened, the mask of control returning. "You just destroyed everything." Elena stepped back, her voice trembling but sure. "No, I just made it visible." The younger operative lunged forward, gun raised. Mara hit the light switch. The room went dark. The gunfire tore through the blackness. 1, 2 deafening shots, sparks bursting as a bullet shattered glass. Elena dove behind a desk, the taste of dust filling her mouth. When the lights flickered back on, Mara was on the floor, clutching her arm, blood seeping through her sleeve. The younger man aimed again, but the caretaker barked, "Stand down." He turned to Elena, fury and disbelief warring in his expression. "You don't even know what you've unleashed." Elena's voice broke. "I don't care. Lies don't deserve peace." The caretaker stepped closer, lowering his weapon. You think you've won? You've just given chaos a microphone. The world won't thank you. They'll tear you apart. She met his eyes. Maybe, but at least they'll see what you did. For a long moment, the two of them stood frozen in the hum of the flickering projector light. The past and the future staring at each other through the smoke of the present. Finally, the caretaker exhaled, his shoulders sinking. He looked toward the door, then back at her. Run, he said quietly. What, before I change my mind? Elena didn't wait to question Mercy. She grabbed Mara's arm, pulling her to her feet. Together, they stumbled through the side exit into the rain, the cold air hitting them like rebirth. Behind them, the building stood in eerie silence, the hum of machines still echoing within. They climbed into a truck parked in the alley, Mara pressing her bleeding arm against her chest. Where are we going? She gasped. Elena started the engine, her jaw set. Anywhere the truth can still breathe. The wipers scraped across the windshield as they drove into the storm. In the distance, far beyond the desert, the first headlines were already being written. The footage had reached the world. Operation Silverlight was no longer a secret, and though she didn't know what the morning would bring, Elena Cruz felt for the first time that she had stopped running, not away from danger, but towards something greater than herself. The truth had finally taken flight. The rain came down harder as Elena drove, streaking the windshield with blurred silver trails that looked almost like falling stars. The storm had swallowed the desert whole. The horizon vanished into gray. Every mile that rolled beneath her tires felt like one more piece of her old life fading into memory. Mara sat beside her, pale and trembling, pressing a torn cloth against her arm. Blood had soaked through it, dark against the fabric. She tried to speak, but Elena shook her head softly. Save your strength, she said. We'll find help soon. The wipers squealed against the glass. The engine hummed low, fighting the rising wind. Neither of them spoke for several minutes, the silence filled only by the sound of rain and the deep rumble of thunder that rolled across the sky. When Mara finally broke the quiet, her voice was faint. You did it, Elena. The upload went through. The whole world will see it now. Elena tightened her grip on the wheel. They'll try to discredit it. They'll call it a hoax, a hack, fake evidence, anything. Maybe, Mara said, her tone steadying. But once the truth touches the air, it never disappears completely. People will ask questions, and the powerful fear questions more than bullets. Elena looked out at the open desert. The rain blurred everything beyond the glass, but she could almost see it. The ripple effect, the spark she had ignited spreading across the world. Screens lighting up in dark rooms. Journalists waking in the middle of the night to breaking alerts. Government offices thrown into quiet panic as their carefully buried history was dragged into daylight. But that vision was cut short when headlights appeared behind them, two pairs closing fast. Her stomach dropped. They're not done. Mara turned, wincing. How can they still be here? The transmission doesn't matter, Elena said. Now it's about control. If they can't stop the truth, they'll erase the messenger. She pressed harder on the accelerator. The truck roared forward, tires slicing through the shallow rivers of rainwater flooding the road. The headlights behind them grew brighter, closer. A voice from Mara, quiet, urgent. Left. There's an old service tunnel. It connects to the storm drains. Locals used it when the floods hit. Elena spotted it. A narrow dirt road branching off the highway, half hidden by scrub and rain. She turned sharply, the truck fishtailing before catching traction. The pursuers followed, their beams slicing through the downpour like white knives. The tunnel appeared ahead, a crumbling arch of concrete half, buried in earth, its mouth yawning open like a throat. She didn't slow down. They plunged into darkness. Inside, The sound of rain was replaced by the roar of water rushing along the tunnel walls. The truck's headlights caught graffiti and twisted rebar. Every turn echoed their movement back at them in ghostly repetition. Mara looked behind them. They're still coming. Elena's jaw tightened. Then we give them something to chase. At the next bend, she yanked the handbrake and cut the lights. The truck skidded sideways, tires screaming against wet concrete, until it came to a stop in the shadows. The pursuing cars roared past moments later, their headlights vanishing into the deeper dark. For a few seconds, all they heard was the echo of engines fading into distance. Elena waited, heart pounding, before whispering, "Now." She turned the wheel gently and guided the truck toward a side opening, an emergency maintenance shaft leading upward. They climbed out, the rain striking their faces again as they emerged into open air. Behind them, the tunnel groaned with the storm. Mara stumbled beside her, clutching her wounded arm. "Where will you go now?" Elena looked at the horizon. Dawn was breaking through the rain, a dull orange glow bleeding into the clouds. "Somewhere they don't expect me to survive." She helped Mara into the passenger seat, then paused before starting the engine. "You should disappear too. New name, new life, you've done enough." Mara gave a small, tired smile. "So have you, but something tells me you won't." Elena didn't answer. She stared at the sunrise for a long moment, the colors spreading like fire across the wet sky. The world had changed overnight, though no one yet understood how deeply. Somewhere out there, headlines were already forming. Words like leak, corruption, covert fund, Silverlight. The kind of truth that no one could unhear. She started the engine and turned the truck toward the mountains. The radio came alive in bursts. News anchors stumbling over reports of a massive data release tied to Cold War operations, governments declining comment. Analysts calling it the most significant intelligence breach of the century. Mara exhaled shakily. "You did it, Elena. You really did." Elena kept her eyes on the road. "We did it, but this is just the beginning." She could feel it, the shift in the air, the tremor beneath the surface. The world had cracked open. What came next would decide what grew from the wreckage, truth or chaos. As the truck climbed the winding road into the rising sun, the last of the rain turned to mist. The world below glistened, washed clean, fragile and new. Elena Cruz had started as a desperate mother searching for a way to survive. Now she carried the burden of a story that belonged to everyone. And though she didn't know what awaited beyond the mountains, she knew one thing with absolute clarity: she would never run again. Because when you've seen what power hides in the dark, you stop fearing the light. The mountains rose ahead like sleeping giants, their peaks swallowed by fog and light. The storm had passed, but the world still trembled in its aftermath. Elena drove in silence, the old truck groaning beneath her, each mile climbing higher into the spine of stone that divided the desert from the high valley beyond. The road was narrow and slick with rain, curling around cliffs that seemed to drop forever. Mara slept beside her, pale and weak, her wounded arm wrapped tight with a torn strip of Elena's jacket. Every so often, she stirred, whispering half-formed words that melted into the hum of the engine. Elena didn't wake her. The woman had done enough, they both had. The radio crackled again, news anchors now frantic, filling the air with disbelief. Words like classified fund, senatorial cover-ups, unauthorized operation, cut through the static. Governments denied, officials vanished, reporters shouted over each other on live feeds that couldn't keep up with the unraveling truth. The world was waking up, and it wasn't ready for what it saw. Elena turned the volume down. She didn't need to hear more. The truth was out there now, beyond her reach, beyond anyone's control. But she also knew what came after revelation, retaliation. And if those in power couldn't silence the truth, they would come for the one who carried it. The truck sputtered as the incline grew steeper. She guided it onto a narrow gravel turnout overlooking the valley below. The sun was breaking through the last of the grey, pouring gold over the wet stone and distant ridges. For a moment it looked almost peaceful, too peaceful to belong to the same world she'd torn open. She stepped out, breathing in the thin mountain air. It was sharp, cold, alive. For the first time in days, the air didn't taste of dust or fear. She could almost believe she'd reached some kind of ending. But endings never came that easily. The sound reached her first, a low thump, rhythmic, mechanical. She looked up and saw the silhouette of a helicopter cutting across the sky. Military grey, no markings, no hesitation. Her chest tightened. They found us. Mara stirred awake inside the truck. What? Get down. Elena dove behind a boulder as the helicopter banked hard, wind whipping her hair across her face. The sound of rotors roared like thunder. A spotlight cut through the morning fog, sweeping across the mountainside. The beam caught the truck, lighting it up in stark white. Mara ducked low. What do we do? Elena's mind raced. They couldn't outrun an aircraft, not up here. We don't run, not this time. The helicopter hovered closer, its searchlight slicing across the rock face until it pinned Elena in its glare. The voice that came through the loudspeaker was cold, controlled. Elena Cruz, stand down. You are in violation of national security directives. Surrender immediately. She rose slowly from behind the boulder, her heart steady despite the roar of wind and metal. The beam of light washed over her face, blinding her. She lifted a hand to shield her eyes. I already surrendered. She shouted back, her voice raw but clear, to the truth. The rotor pitch changed. A door slid open on the side of the chopper. 2 soldiers appeared. Black armor, visors down, weapons slung. The sound of their descent ropes unfurling filled the air. Elena ducked back behind cover as they hit the ground, boots crunching against gravel. Mara's breath quickened. There's 2 of them, maybe 3. Stay here, Elena whispered. If they take me, you drive. You find a place with signal and send everything we have to every name on that contact list. Mara grabbed her wrist. You can't fight them. Elena looked at her, eyes burning with a calm she didn't understand until now. I'm not fighting them. I'm ending this. She waited until one of the soldiers moved closer, then stepped out with her hands raised. The glare caught her again, bleaching her into silhouette. I'm unarmed, she said. You don't have to do this. The nearer soldier froze. The second one moved to flank her. Their voices were muffled by their helmets. Target confirmed. Orders. Static cracked in their earpieces. Then another voice, low, commanding, came through the frequency. It wasn't a soldier's tone. It was familiar, calm, controlled. The caretaker, alive, he said. Bring her in alive. Elena's stomach turned. The man she thought had given her a chance to escape was still pulling the strings. His mercy had been calculation. He hadn't let her go. He'd led her here. Copy. The soldier said. They moved toward her. The moment they reached for her arms, something in her snapped. She spun away, grabbing a loose rock and striking the nearest soldier's visor. It cracked, sending him stumbling backward. She dove for the ground, rolling behind another boulder as bullets sparked against the stone. Mara screamed inside the truck. Elena, go, Elena shouted. Now, the engine roared. The truck lurched forward, tires spitting gravel. One of the soldiers turned and fired. The rear window shattered. Elena felt the echo of her heartbeat in her throat. The helicopter lifted again, repositioning. The wash from its rotors flattened the grass and dust. Elena crawled to the edge of the ridge, searching desperately for anything she could use, any way to turn this moment from capture to chance. And then she saw it, a ridge of rock splitting away from the mountain's side, weakened by the storm. If she could draw them close enough. She waited until they were within shouting distance, then stood, hands raised again. You want me? Come take me. The soldiers advanced cautiously, their shadows long against the rock. The ground beneath them groaned, small stones tumbling loose. Elena took one step back, then another. The crack beneath her heel deepened. The lead soldier shouted something she couldn't hear over the wind. Then the cliff gave way. For a moment, the world became sound and motion, stone breaking, air rushing, the helicopter lurching backward in panic as the ledge collapsed. Elena dropped to her knees, gripping a jut of rock as the soldiers tumbled down the slope in a blur of black and dust. The sound of their fall was swallowed by the roar of the valley. When the dust cleared, the helicopter hovered uncertainly, its pilot adjusting to the sudden loss of ground support. Elena forced herself up, body trembling, and stumbled toward the truck, which had stopped at the edge of the next curve. Mara leaned out the window, eyes wide, relief and terror warring across her face. "Elena, get in." Elena climbed into the cab just as the chopper began to circle back. She slammed her foot on the pedal, and the truck surged forward, tires spinning on the wet stone. The valley opened before them, sunlight spilling through the clouds like a promise. Behind them, the mountain crumbled where the cliff had fallen, sending a thunder of debris cascading down the slope. Mara looked back, her voice trembling. "They'll keep coming." Elena's eyes were fixed ahead. "Then we keep driving." She didn't look in the mirror again. Whatever followed could chase shadows. She was done being one. The helicopter hovered high above, unable to descend through the rising dust cloud. Below it, the scars of collapse marked the place where the truth had refused to be buried again. And as Elena drove down the winding road, the first rays of full sunlight struck the valley, bright, blinding, unstoppable. For the first time, the world didn't look abandoned, it looked awake. The sun had fully broken through by the time Elena and Mara reached the valley floor. The storm had washed the world clean, leaving the air sharp and new, filled with the scent of rain, soaked earth. The mountains behind them stood in solemn silence, their peaks wrapped in silver light. For the first time in what felt like forever, the sound of pursuit was gone. No engines, no blades, just wind and breath. The road ahead stretched endlessly through the open basin, shimmering with sunlight that bounced off shallow pools of rainwater. Elena slowed the truck, her trembling hands still gripping the steering wheel as the weight of what had just happened began to settle. Mara leaned back against the seat, pale but breathing steadily. The makeshift bandage around her arm was dark with dried blood, but her eyes were clear now. "Are we safe?" she asked quietly. Elena didn't answer right away. She stared out at the horizon, watching the shifting light. Safe wasn't a word that existed anymore, not for her, not after what she'd done. Finally, she said, "For now." They drove in silence for a while. The radio, still on low, crackled with fragments of chaos, the sound of a world catching fire with truth. Newscasters tripped over each other, piecing together timelines, connecting names, broadcasting documents that had already gone viral. Operation Silverlight was now on every screen. Some said it was the biggest revelation of the decade. Others called it a lie, a digital illusion, but none of that mattered. The lie had been seen, and once seen, it could never be unseen. Elena turned off the radio. "They'll fight it," she said quietly. "They'll bury it again if they can." Mara looked at her, exhausted but firm. "Not this time. You didn't just release files, Elena. You lit a fuse, the kind that spreads on its own." Elena exhaled, staring at her hands, dirty, bruised, trembling. She wasn't sure if what she felt was victory or just relief. Maybe both. The truth was free, but it had cost everything, her home, her safety, her anonymity. And maybe Daniel's life. The thought pierced through the calm like a blade. She gripped the wheel tighter. "He said the truth would make me untouchable, but all it's made me is hunted." Mara gave a faint smile. "That's how it always starts." The truck rolled past a weathered sign marking the edge of a small, forgotten town. Sierra Cross. Population faded from the wood long ago. A church bell tower leaned over the main street, its rusted cross glinting in the light. Elena slowed as they passed shuttered storefronts and a diner with its windows broken but curtains still swaying in the breeze. The world felt abandoned, suspended somewhere between ruin and rebirth. She pulled over near the edge of town, parking beside a dry fountain in a cracked square. The silence here was almost holy. Birds darted between the eaves of the buildings, their wings flashing white in the sun. Elena stepped out and stood in the middle of the road, her boots sinking slightly in the damp dust. The air was cool now, the last of the storm's breath brushing against her skin. For a moment, she just stood there breathing, feeling, existing. Mara joined her a moment later, leaning against the truck for support. "What now?" she asked. Elena looked up at the sky. The clouds were breaking apart, revealing the deep, endless blue beyond. "Now we wait. The truth is out there doing what it was always meant to do. We gave it wings. The rest isn't ours to control." Mara nodded slowly. "And you?" Elena turned, a faint, weary smile curving her lips. "I've been running since the day I placed that first bid. Maybe it's time I stop." She walked toward the edge of the square where the road disappeared into the open desert. The wind tugged gently at her jacket, carrying the scent of sage and wet earth. In the distance, the faint sound of sirens echoed through the valley, not for her this time, but for the world that had just woken up. Mara called after her, "You think they'll come for you again?" Elena glanced over her shoulder. "Maybe, but if they do, they won't find the same woman they chased." She turned back toward the horizon. The sunlight caught her face, washing it in gold. "I'm not running from them anymore. I'm walking toward whatever comes next." Mara smiled faintly. "And if whatever comes next is another fight?" Elena's eyes softened. "Then I'll face it. The truth doesn't belong to anyone, not even me. I just carried it long enough for the world to see it." They stood there for a while, watching the light shift across the valley, each second marking the quiet transformation of everything that had been hidden. Somewhere out there, screens still flickered with her name, her face, her voice. Some called her a hero, others called her a criminal, but Elena Cruz had stopped caring about the labels. She had uncovered the buried heart of a lie and handed it back to the world. And now, standing in that fragile peace between destruction and dawn, she finally understood what redemption really meant. It wasn't about being forgiven. It was about doing something that mattered, something that would outlast fear. The wind rose once more, carrying dust and the faint echo of engines far away, fading into nothing. Elena closed her eyes and whispered, "We're going to be okay." This time, she didn't say it to convince herself. This time it was true. The morning light spilled across the horizon like molten gold, cutting through the mist that lingered over the desert. Elena stood on the roof of an abandoned motel, watching the sun rise over a world that had changed overnight. Down below, the wind carried fragments of sound from a battery-powered radio perched on the truck hood. Voices trembling with disbelief, urgency, revelation. The Silverlight files continue to spread globally, replicated across independent networks after the initial leak. Governments issuing statements of concern, major financial institutions under investigation. The words washed over her like distant thunder. They didn't sound real even now. The world was catching up to the truth she had unearthed, and the system that had once hidden everything was beginning to fracture under its own weight. For days, Elena and Mara had drifted between safe towns, staying just long enough to refuel, to listen, to watch. No one had come after them. Not yet. But she knew better than to believe the silence meant safety. Power didn't surrender overnight. It only regathered, shifted its face, and waited. She climbed down slowly, the metal ladder creaking beneath her boots. Mara sat near the truck, wrapped in an old blanket, her arms still bound but healing. Her skin was pale, her eyes shadowed from exhaustion, but there was a calm in her face that hadn't been there before. "Any new updates?" Elena asked. Mara nodded toward the radio. "They've confirmed at least 6 resignations. Senators, contractors, a few high-ranking officials, and—" She hesitated. "They found something in the archives, a statement, handwritten, dated 1970, Mercer's final report." Elena froze. What did it say? Mara looked up at her. It said, "The operation is self-perpetuating. Even if the transport is lost, the wealth has already become influence. The system will continue on its own. The cargo was never the silver, it was the power." Elena sank against the side of the truck, the words settling deep into her chest. The truth wasn't just about missing money or stolen metal. It was about a seed planted decades ago that had grown into an entire forest of corruption, untouchable, invisible, self-sustaining. "So it never ended," she murmured. Mara shook her head. "No, but at least now the roots are exposed." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the low hum of static. Somewhere out there, newscasters still argued, leaders still denied, and the world kept turning. But this morning felt different, lower, heavier, like the planet itself had taken a breath it had been holding for 50 years. Elena pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders and walked a few steps away, her boots crunching against gravel. The motel's faded sign flickered weakly behind her, rooms 24/7. The irony made her smile. There was no rest in truth, no open door that stayed safe forever. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. An unknown number. She almost ignored it, then answered with cautious breath. "Hello." The voice that replied was faint, rough with static. "Elena." Her heart stilled. "Daniel, it's me," he said, the sound of distant traffic breaking in and out. "I made it out." Her knees nearly gave, they said. I know what they said. They tried, but they underestimated how many of us were watching. Your upload, your story, it's everywhere. They can't stop it. It's like trying to catch sunlight in their hands. Elena closed her eyes, relief and grief mixing into something wordless. "I thought you were gone." "They thought so too," Daniel said, a hint of a laugh in his tired voice. "I went dark for a while, but listen, this isn't over. People are rallying around it. Investigators, journalists, whistleblowers. You gave them something to fight for. But they'll come for you again, Elena. You're the face of this now." "I don't want to be the face," she whispered. "I just wanted to be free." "I know," he said softly, "but freedom doesn't come quietly. You gave the world a key, and now it's choosing whether to open the door or burn the house down." Her throat tightened. "What should I do?" "Stay alive," Daniel said. "Stay invisible. Don't trust the noise. They'll twist the truth to make you the villain. They already are. You'll see headlines calling you a criminal, a spy, a liar. But it doesn't matter. The story is bigger than you now, and that's what makes it unstoppable." She nodded, tears blurring her vision even though he couldn't see her. "Thank you, Daniel, for everything." There was a pause, a long, quiet one filled only with the faint hum of static. Then he said, "Elena, you didn't just change the story, you changed how stories are told." The line went dead. She stood there for a long time, staring at the phone, the desert wind tugging at her hair. Mara approached slowly, her voice low. "He's alive." Elena nodded, "and still fighting." Mara smiled faintly. "Then so are we." They climbed back into the truck, heading toward the open road. The world around them was shifting. Cities waking to protests, governments scrambling for statements, the old order cracking under the weight of exposure. As they drove, Elena looked up at the wide, blue sky, the same sky that had once hung over the airfield where it all began, the graveyard of giants. She remembered the rusted wings, the silence of the cargo hold, the moment she pried open that first crate and saw the silver gleam of history's lie staring back at her. That single glint had started all of this, the fear, the chase, the awakening. And now, as the truck disappeared down the road, the story of Operation Silverlight was no longer hidden in the belly of a forgotten plane. It was everywhere, unstoppable, undeniable, alive. Elena Cruz had become both the hunted and the herald. And though she carried the scars of what it had cost, somewhere deep within, a quiet certainty took root, the kind that only truth can leave behind. The storm was over, but the reckoning had just begun. The road stretched endlessly beneath the tires, humming with the rhythm of distance and time. The sky above had softened into a pale blue, streaked with the remnants of morning clouds. Elena kept her hands steady on the wheel, but her thoughts churned like the desert wind outside. Every headline, every broadcast that had mentioned her name, replayed in her head. Every truth came with a price, and now she was the receipt written in blood and light. Mara dozed beside her, her breathing shallow but even. The tension in her shoulders had eased slightly, and in that stillness, Elena found a strange comfort. They'd survived longer than anyone expected. The truth had bought them time. Nothing more, but nothing less. At the next mile marker, Elena slowed. The road forked ahead. One path cutting toward the city where the world was boiling over in protests and chaos. The other, a narrow, forgotten stretch leading deeper into the desert, into the quiet. She chose the quiet. They drove until the signs of civilization faded, until the radio signal was gone, and the horizon became a perfect, unbroken line. The land was dry and open, the kind of place that remembered everything but told nothing. When she finally stopped, the air was still. The wind had even stopped whispering. Mara woke slowly, blinking against the light. "Where are we?" Elena stepped out, her boots crunching on gravel. "Somewhere the world won't look yet." They walked a few paces away from the truck. The silence was so thick it pressed against her ears. In that emptiness, she could almost hear her heartbeat, the same rhythm that had kept her alive when everything else tried to break her. Mara turned toward her. "You know it won't stop. The story's out, but they'll build a new lie to bury the old one. That's how it works." "I know," Elena said softly, "but this time they'll have to build it in daylight." She knelt and picked up a handful of dust, letting it slip through her fingers. The grains caught the sunlight, glowing for a brief second before disappearing into the wind. Truth isn't permanent, it doesn't stay clean, but it leaves stains that never wash away. Mara's gaze softened. "You sound like someone who's finished running." Elena smiled faintly. "Maybe I am." They walked back to the truck. Elena opened the passenger door and pulled out a small metal box she'd been carrying since the beginning. A piece of the plane's hull, cut from the cargo bay the night she'd first discovered the silver. The surface was etched with a faded serial number, the last remnant of Flight 9X77. She ran her fingers across it. "This started as desperation," she said quietly. "I thought I was just buying junk, a broken thing to fix and sell, but it was never about the plane. It was about everything that plane carried." Mara tilted her head. "And what did it carry, really?" Elena looked up at the sky. "Proof that greed doesn't die, it just changes uniforms. But also proof that people still have a choice, even when the world tells them they don't." The wind picked up again, brushing across her face. It carried no fear this time, only the scent of rain lingering somewhere far away. They stood in silence for a long while. The sun climbed higher, washing the desert in bright, endless light. Then, faintly, from the truck's open radio, came the sound of a reporter's voice, calm, urgent, filled with wonder. Public reaction to the Silverlight revelations continues to grow. Protests have spread across 12 cities. Governments are forming inquiry commissions. A woman named Elena Cruz, believed to have discovered the original evidence, has become a symbol of moral resistance and truth. Her whereabouts remain unknown. Mara smiled faintly, her voice dry but warm. Unknown. I think that's your favorite word now. Elena closed the door and leaned against it, her eyes on the horizon. It's better than forgotten. The radio continued to hum in the background, the world's noise reduced to a distant echo. Somewhere, change was happening, slow, uneven but real. She didn't need to see it. It was enough to know it had begun. As the afternoon light softened into gold, Elena started the engine again. The truck rumbled to life, the sound steady, defiant. Mara looked at her. Where to? Elena smiled, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. Anywhere that still needs truth. The truck rolled forward, its shadow stretching long behind them, merging with the empty road. The desert shimmered, vast and timeless, as if holding its breath. The wind rose, carrying faint echoes of the past, the hum of engines, the rattle of silver, the whisper of a name once buried in silence. And then, just as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the road disappeared into light. Elena Cruz kept driving, not as the woman who found the fortune, not as the fugitive who fled the lie, but as the voice that refused to die when the world needed to remember. The truth had taken everything from her, yet in its ashes it had given her something greater. Freedom. The world had begun to turn differently, not faster, not slower, just heavier. Every city breathed a little louder now, its streets echoing with the sound of people who had begun to ask questions. And somewhere, beneath the noise of headlines and protests, the story of Operation Silverlight had become more than a scandal. It had become a mirror. Elena Cruz watched it unfold from the quiet edges of the world. She was no longer running, but she wasn't free either. Freedom, she'd learned, wasn't the absence of chains. It was the courage to keep walking with them. She had found refuge in a small coastal town, 300 miles from the desert. A place where the air smelled of salt and eucalyptus, and the waves broke endlessly against the cliffs like the heartbeat of something eternal. The locals called her Lena. No one asked for more. No one cared to. Each morning, she walked down to the shoreline as the sun rose over the horizon, painting the ocean in molten gold. She carried a small silver bar in her pocket, the only one she'd kept from the plane. It wasn't for wealth or proof anymore. It was a reminder, a fragment of the story that had changed everything. News still reached her, even here. The fallout was monumental. Names once untouchable had fallen. Fortunes had vanished overnight. Countries called for reforms. And for the first time in decades, people were demanding transparency from systems that had long thrived in darkness. Yet, with every victory came new manipulations. New power dressed itself in the same old suit, smiling for cameras, promising accountability. Elena understood that the machine had simply shifted gears. It wasn't dead, it was adapting. But for every lie that resurfaced, there were now millions of eyes watching. That was enough. She walked back toward the small house she now rented on the edge of the cliffs. A weathered structure with peeling paint and a view of the endless sea. Inside, the walls were lined with old photographs, some of Mateo smiling in the sunlight, his small hands clutching a seashell, others of nothing but sky and ocean, frames of quiet reminders that she was still alive. Mateo was safe, that was all that mattered. He lived with her sister now, far from the chaos she had unleashed. Every few days, they spoke over encrypted calls. He didn't understand everything that had happened, but he knew his mother had done something important, something good. "Are you still hiding, Mama?" he had asked once. his voice soft through the static. Not hiding, she had said, just resting, and for the first time in her life that word felt honest. That evening, as dusk fell, she sat on the porch with a cup of tea and the sound of waves rolling below. The sky turned violet, then deepened into night. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the remnants of power she'd torn open were still burning, quietly, invisibly, inevitably. She switched on a small radio she kept by the door. Static gave way to a familiar voice, the journalist she once trusted, now reporting from the very heart of the chaos. In what's being called the most significant leak in modern history, the Silverlight files have sparked global reform movements across more than 20 nations. While the original source of the leak remains unconfirmed, anonymous statements from whistleblowers describe it as a message from someone who refused to look away. Elena smiled faintly, eyes glinting in the lamplight. A message from someone who refused to look away. That was enough of a name for her. She took the silver bar from her pocket and held it against the fading glow of the horizon. The surface caught the last of the light, reflecting a single, brilliant flare before dimming to dusk. "I thought you were just metal," she whispered. "Turns out you were memory." The wind carried her words out to sea, scattering them across the waves. And though no one was there to hear it, Elena Cruz felt for the first time the weight of silence that didn't feel like fear. It felt like peace. She leaned back in her chair as the stars began to appear, one by one, patient, eternal. The kind of light that never burns too bright to disappear. Behind her, on the small table by the door, lay an envelope addressed in careful handwriting, "To the Foundation for Women and Truth, Santiago Branch." Inside was a check drawn from the last of her savings, and a handwritten note: "Build something honest, not in my name, but in ours, for every woman who's ever been told she shouldn't look too closely." The night deepened, but the air remained warm. The tide rose, and with it came the steady rhythm of something new being born in the world. Elena closed her eyes and let the sound carry her. For once, she didn't think of what had been lost, or what might come next. The truth had found its place, and so had she. As the waves rolled beneath the cliffs, the world turned quietly toward morning, reborn, imperfect, but awake. The sea whispered beneath the cliffs, a slow, eternal rhythm that seemed to wash the last traces of chaos from the air. The moon had risen high over the water, casting long silver paths across the waves, a reflection that shimmered like liquid memory. Elena sat in silence, her hands folded around the still, warm cup beside her, eyes tracing that path as though it led to every place she'd once been, every truth she'd dared to touch. For the first time in months, her mind wasn't racing. No footsteps in the dark, no sirens, no hum of helicopters. Just wind, salt, and the patient sound of the tide. Inside the house, the old radio still murmured softly. The newscaster's voice was calm, deliberate, the kind that carried both awe and exhaustion. In the wake of the Silverlight revelations, several global task forces have been established to investigate the flow of off-record military assets during the Cold War. Public trust remains fractured, but reform initiatives have surged worldwide. Sources confirm that several whistleblower foundations have been created under anonymous patronage, one in particular, dedicated to supporting women journalists, has already received major funding from undisclosed donors. Elena smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. She knew exactly where that funding came from. She rose from her chair and walked toward the edge of the cliff, her bare feet sinking into the cool grass. The wind lifted her hair, tugging gently like an old friend. Down below, The waves crashed and curled against the rocks, restless, beautiful, untamable. This was where it all began for her, not in this place, but in the feeling, the defiance, the refusal to stay still when the world demanded silence. She had spent her life surviving storms that weren't meant to be survived. Now she stood in their aftermath, not as a fugitive, but as proof that even one voice, one desperate, ordinary voice, could change the shape of the sky. A soft chime came from inside the house, a message. She stepped back inside and picked up the small satellite tablet on the counter. A secure communication line glowed on the screen, pulsing gently. She opened it. From Daniel Ray's subject, "They're listening now." Elena, they published everything, not just the files, but the transcripts, the communications, the cover-ups. People are marching in cities I've never even heard of. You should see it: candles, banners, signs with your name and the word truth written beside it. I know you don't want that kind of attention, but this isn't about fame anymore. It's about permission. You gave people permission to believe that truth is worth the risk again. I'm headed to Geneva tomorrow. They're assembling a coalition of journalists and reformers. They want to make Silverlight the foundation of something bigger, a system that forces transparency across borders. We're calling it the Horizon Network. If you ever decide to return, there will always be a place for you there. But if you don't, if you choose to stay by the ocean, just know you already did your part. The rest of us are carrying it now. Wherever you are, stay in the light. Daniel. Elena's throat tightened. She read the message twice, then set the tablet down beside the window, where the reflection of the moon glowed across the glass. The Horizon Network, a movement born from buried truth. The name felt right. Outside, the sea roared again, louder this time, as if answering him. She poured the last of her tea into the soil beneath the steps, an old habit, a small ritual of thanks. Then she looked back toward the horizon, where the faintest lights of a fishing boat moved like a slow constellation across the dark water. She reached into her pocket and held up the silver bar, tarnished now, its edges worn smooth from the months she'd carried it. She turned it over once, twice, before walking to the cliff's edge and holding it up to the moonlight. "For everything you were taken for," she whispered, "may you finally belong to no one." Then she threw it into the sea. The splash was small, but it echoed far below, caught by the wind, swallowed by the waves. The silver disappeared into darkness, carried back into the endless motion of the deep. Elena stood there a moment longer, the wind tangling her hair, the stars glittering like shards of all the truths she'd set free. Somewhere behind her, the radio announced another headline: voices debating, analyzing, arguing about the implications of her story. But she no longer needed to listen. The world would keep speaking. It didn't need her to guide it anymore. She turned back toward the house, her silhouette framed against the moonlit sea. The door closed softly behind her, and for the first time in a long time, the quiet didn't feel like absence. It felt like peace earned, not given. Outside, the tide kept rising and falling, washing away the last footprints from the edge of the cliff. And as the night deepened, the horizon gleamed silver, not from metal, not from wealth, but from the reflection of a truth too bright to ever be buried again. Elena Cruz had disappeared from the world's eyes, but her story remained drifting through it like light on water. The morning arrived without fanfare, no alarms, no headlines, no fear, just light, soft, golden light spilling through the salt-stained windows of Elena's cottage by the sea. It touched everything it could reach: the chipped teacup on the counter, the folded blanket by the chair, the handwritten note still pinned to the wall. She woke slowly, to the hush of waves and the creak of wooden beams. For a moment, she didn't move. She simply lay there, eyes open, breathing in the scent of the ocean air. No nightmares this time. No flash of gunfire or the echo of running feet. Just quiet. When she finally rose, the horizon was already glowing, a line of gold stretching endlessly across the blue. She brewed coffee, listening to the rhythmic percussion of the waves below, each crash a memory dissolving. The world she knew was still burning out there, but here for a little while the fire couldn't reach her. She stepped outside, cup in hand, and stood on the cliff's edge. The sea breeze pressed against her, cold and pure. Below, the water shimmered silver where the sun met its surface, as if it still remembered the bar she had thrown into its depths. It had been 3 months since she'd heard Daniel's last message, since the Horizon Network was born. 3 months since her name had last been spoken aloud on the news. 3 months of silence that felt like the first breath after drowning. The world had changed, but not in the way people expected. The files had become the cornerstone of a movement, yes, but truth, Elena had learned, never came clean. Every revelation unearthed new lies. Every reform carried new shadows, but still people kept fighting. Still the tide refused to retreat, and that was enough. Her days had become simple. She helped an old fisherman repair his nets. She worked at the small cafe down the road, where tourists sometimes spoke in hushed tones about that leak. Without realizing, the woman serving them coffee had been the one who started it all. She didn't correct them. She just smiled, but there were moments, quiet ones at dusk, when the past crept back like the tide. The airfield, the sound of rusted hinges, the weight of a crowbar in her hands, the first glimpse of silver. And then Daniel's voice breaking through the chaos, saying, "You changed how stories are told." Now those stories belong to everyone. The distant cry of gulls snapped her from her thoughts. She turned to see a man making his way up the narrow path from the beach. A stranger, dressed plainly, carrying something under his arm. Elena Cruz, he called. Her pulse jumped. The name sounded strange here, like a ghost spoken aloud. Yes, he stopped a few feet away and offered a small, polite smile. "I'm sorry to bother you. My name's Tom Keller. I'm a documentarian with Horizon Media." Her breath caught. "The network?" He nodded. "We've been piecing together a final chronicle of Silverlight. Its origins, the fallout, everything it changed. The world's seen the evidence, but not the heart of it. We're building something human." He held out the folder in his hand. "We'd like to include your voice." Elena took the folder but didn't open it. "You already have my voice. It's in every broadcast, every protest, every story that came after. That's enough." Tom studied her quietly. "Maybe, but one day truth turns into myth, and when it does, someone has to remind the world that it wasn't magic. It was just a woman who refused to stop asking questions." She looked away, the sea's reflection flickering across her face. "And if I talk, will they finally let it go? Maybe not," he said softly, "but they'll remember you instead of the noise." The wind rose between them, lifting her hair, scattering the salt through the air like snow. Elena traced the folder's edge with her fingers. She didn't need more fame or recognition. She had spent her life running from both, but a part of her, buried deep, wanted her son to grow up knowing not the chaos of her choices, but the reason behind them. She finally nodded once. "Not a documentary," she said quietly. "A letter, something you can read when I'm gone." Tom smiled, understanding immediately. "Then we'll wait for your words." He turned and made his way back down the hill, his footsteps fading into the wind. Elena stood there long after he disappeared from view, the folder still unopened in her hand. The sea stretched endlessly before her, vast and alive, whispering in its slow, eternal rhythm. That night, she sat at her desk beneath the dim lamplight, the pages of an old notebook spread before her. She opened it to a clean page and began to write. My name is Elena Cruz. Once I bought a forgotten plane for $300. Inside it was a story that didn't belong to me, but I told it anyway, because silence is the weapon they count on most. Because truth, even when it burns, is the only thing that keeps us human. She paused, staring at the words as the wind rattled the windowpane. Outside, the tide was coming in again, the sea whispering like an old friend against the cliffs. She set her pen down, leaned back, and closed her eyes. The world, she thought, didn't need more heroes. It just needed more people who didn't look away. And as the moon rose high over the coast, the woman who had once been hunted for a secret no one wanted to hear finally allowed herself to rest, knowing the echo of her truth would outlive her name. The wind outside had calmed to a whisper by the time Elena lifted her pen again. The room was dim except for the glow of the small desk lamp, its light spilling across the open notebook, illuminating the words she had begun hours earlier. The sea murmured softly below the cliffs, steady and eternal, as if it too were listening. She continued to write, her hand steady, her words flowing not as confessions, but as something gentler, an offering. I used to think truth was like silver, heavy, precious, something to guard, but I was wrong. Truth is light. It doesn't belong in vaults or boxes. It belongs to everyone willing to open their eyes even when it blinds them. She paused, glancing toward the window. The moon hung low over the ocean, painting the waves in pale silver, the same color as the bars that had once haunted her dreams. Somewhere beneath that surface, the peace she had thrown away months ago slept in silence, turning slowly in the tide. She wrote again, "If someone finds this someday, if the world forgets my name or twists it into something I never was, remember this, I didn't want to be brave, I was terrified, but fear is where truth begins. The rest is just choosing not to turn back." Her handwriting wavered once, then steadied. She reached for the small photograph resting on the corner of her desk. Mateo, laughing in the sun, his hair whipped wild by the wind. She smiled faintly and slid it between the notebook pages. "For my son, who will grow up in a world I only began to change, may you never mistake quiet for peace or chaos for failure. The world will always bend toward silence, push back." The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking each heartbeat, each breath. When she finally set the pen down, the words filled several pages. Simple, unpolished, alive. They weren't a story. They were a map. Elena tore the pages from the notebook, folded them carefully, and slipped them into the folder the documentarian had left behind. She sealed it with a single strip of tape, then scrawled across the front in her looping hand, "To be opened when the world forgets." She placed it inside a small wooden chest by the window, beside the old flight log she'd kept from the cargo plane. Two relics of a past that had refused to stay buried. When she stepped outside, dawn was just beginning to bloom, a thin line of rose gold stretching across the horizon. The air was cool, tasting faintly of salt and something pure. The cliffs below were shadowed, but she could already see the shimmer of waves reflecting the first light of morning. Elena walked to the edge and stood there for a long time, her hair stirring in the breeze, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Somewhere beyond that line, people she would never meet were marching, building, speaking, carrying forward what she had begun. The world didn't know her face anymore, but it didn't need to. The truth had a life of its own now. It had outgrown her. Behind her, the old radio on the porch crackled faintly to life. A reporter's voice, gentle, reverent, drifted through the air. "It has been 1 year since the Silverlight revelations reshaped global policy. Though the origin of the leak remains uncertain, one thing is clear: History's greatest secrets are no longer safe in the dark. Somewhere, a single choice set this all in motion, and the world hasn't stopped moving since. Elena smiled, her eyes glistening as she whispered to the wind, "Good." She turned away from the cliff and walked toward the small wooden sign she had carved by hand weeks ago. It reads simply, "The Foundation for Women and Truth Coastal Branch." The old fisherman's daughter, the cafe owner, and a handful of local women had helped her build it from the ground up. What had started as a quiet project, a place for women to learn, write, and be heard, had grown into something larger. They called it a sanctuary, though Elena always corrected them softly. Not sanctuary, she would say, signal. Inside, typewriters clicked softly. Young women worked at old desks salvaged from the village, their eyes alive with purpose. Letters, reports, stories. They filled the walls, ready to be sent to the Horizon Network. Truth, reborn one page at a time. When Elena entered, the chatter quieted. A girl no older than 18 smiled up from her desk. "Morning, Miss Lena. You missed sunrise again." Elena laughed gently. "I didn't miss it. I just watched it from the edge." She moved among them, checking pages, offering quiet words, her voice carrying a steadiness that the younger ones seemed to draw strength from. The light through the windows grew brighter, turning everything gold. Outside, the sea roared against the cliffs, a constant reminder of both endings and beginnings. And as the day unfolded, Elena found herself at the doorway once more, looking out toward the horizon. She thought of the plain, the silver, the lies that had collapsed like sand. She thought of the men who had tried to bury the truth, and of the silence that had once suffocated her. Then she thought of her son's laughter, Daniel's faith, Mara's courage, and the thousands of voices now echoing across the world because one woman refused to look away. The world was still flawed, still wounded, but it was awake. Elena Cruz closed her eyes and let the wind carry across her face. The sound of the sea rose again, vast and unending, and she whispered into it, words no one but the waves would ever hear. Every truth begins as a whisper, and sometimes that's enough. The sun lifted fully above the horizon, flooding the coast in golden light. Inside the small foundation, the typewriters clattered to life again, voices rising in unison with the sound of the surf. Elena turned back toward them, her figure framed in sunlight. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a survivor or a fugitive or a symbol. She simply felt free. The sea was calm that morning, so calm it looked like glass. The horizon melted into the sky in a blur of silver and blue, the line between heaven and water almost invisible. Elena stood barefoot at the edge of the cliff, the cool grass brushing her ankles, the wind soft against her face. The air carried the faint scent of rain even though the sky was clear. It had been 2 years since the world learned the truth. 2 years since her name stopped appearing in headlines. 2 years since Operation Silverlight became history instead of danger. The world had moved on, as it always does. The shock had faded into legislation, inquiry, and politics. A few of the powerful had fallen. Others simply changed masks. Nations apologized. Monuments were renamed. But the real change, the quiet humankind, had taken root in places no one televised. She saw it every day. In the women who came to her small coastal foundation to learn, to write, to speak without permission. In the way strangers no longer lowered their voices when they talked about corruption. In the way the word truth had stopped sounding like rebellion and started sounding like survival. Elena breathed deeply, the wind tangling her hair. Behind her, the white cottage hummed softly with life. The foundation had grown, letters stacked high on tables, typewriters clattering, the sound of hope written into paper. It had become what she once wished for the world to be, not perfect, but honest. She smiled faintly, looking down at the ocean far below. Somewhere in that endless blue lay the silver bar she had thrown away. Sometimes she wondered if it still glimmered when the light struck just right, or if the sea had long ago swallowed it whole. Either way, it didn't matter. The real treasure had never been what gleamed in darkness. It had been what woke in her the moment she decided to bring the truth into the light. Footsteps approached behind her. Mara? Her friend's voice was softer now, years older, but still carrying the same quiet resolve. The new volunteers are asking if you'll speak to them today. They're nervous. Elena turned, smiling. They shouldn't be. I'm not some legend. I'm just someone who got tired of being quiet. Mara chuckled. You say that, but they hang on every word. To them, you're the reason the world feels different. Elena's eyes drifted back to the horizon. The world was ready. I just helped it listen. They stood together for a moment, the wind wrapping around them like a shared memory. The sunlight caught on the water below, sending a single beam flashing toward the cliffs, a fleeting reminder of the silver that had once consumed her life. Sometimes, Mara said softly, I think about the plane, about how something so broken could hide something so powerful. Elena nodded. That's what truth is, isn't it? Always hiding in wreckage. Mara smiled. Then maybe we should teach that. We already are. They walked back toward the cottage, the sound of the sea behind them like a pulse that would never stop. Inside, the rooms were alive with voices, women and men of every age working side by side, their stories unfolding into something greater than any of them. Elena paused at the doorway, watching as a young girl read aloud from a page she'd written. Her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger with every line. The words weren't about politics or corruption. They were about courage, the simple act of telling the truth even when no one listens. When the girl finished, the room fell silent, then erupted in applause. Elena smiled, her heart swelling quietly in her chest. This was the future, the legacy she had never meant to build but had somehow become. She turned to Mara, her voice low, almost a whisper. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd never bought that plane? Mara's gaze softened. Then someone else would have. Maybe not that day, maybe not that way. But the truth always finds a way to rise, Elena. You just gave it wings. Elena's eyes glistened as she looked out the window one last time at the horizon, the place where it had all begun, where her desperation had collided with destiny. The world beyond was vast, flawed, unfinished. But it was awake, and for the first time, she no longer felt like the woman who uncovered the past. She felt like the woman who had learned to live after it. That evening, as the sun sank behind the ocean and painted the waves in molten light, Elena sat at her desk with a fresh sheet of paper and began to write again. Not a confession this time, but a story. One she could leave behind. There are two kinds of silence, she wrote, the kind that hides the truth and the kind that comes when the truth has finally been spoken. She paused, smiling as the first stars began to appear above the sea. Elena Cruz had lived long enough to hear the silence of peace, and as the night settled softly over the cliffs, she whispered to it the only prayer she still remembered, let this light never go out. The waves answered in their endless rhythm, steady, faithful, eternal. The evening fell slowly, draping the coastline in violet and gold. The world outside Elena's window seemed to breathe with her, steady, calm, alive. The foundation had gone quiet for the night, the typewriters covered, the lamps dimmed. Only the faint hum of the sea and the distant laughter of the young volunteers drifted through the open windows. Elena sat at her desk, pen still in hand, though the ink had long dried on her final line. The paper before her gleamed faintly in the lamplight, its final words echoing like a whisper between the walls. "Let this light never go out." She traced the sentence with her fingertip, not to change it, but to feel its truth one more time. Outside, the waves rolled against the cliffs, soft as breathing. For a moment, she closed her eyes and let the sound carry her back, not to the chaos, not to the fear, but to the moment that had started it all. That silent, forgotten airfield under a dying sun, the rusted wings, the dust, the door she'd pried open, and the glint that had rewritten everything. How strange, she thought, that something born from desperation could end in peace. Her gaze shifted to the small wooden chest by the window, the one that held her letter, the old flight log, and a few yellowing photographs. She rose and crossed the room, her footsteps soft against the worn floorboards. When she opened the chest, the scent of old paper and salt air filled the room. She smiled faintly and reached inside. Beneath the folded papers lay an envelope marked with her son's name, Matteo. Her fingers lingered on it. The ink had faded slightly, the letters curved with the softness of years. She'd written it long ago, when she wasn't sure she'd live to see him again. A letter meant to explain what words had never been able to. Why she'd done what she'd done, why she'd chosen the truth even when it broke their world apart. She unfolded it now, though she knew every line by heart. "My dear Matteo, by the time you read this, the world will already know my story. Some will call me brave, others will call me foolish. Both will be right. I didn't set out to change the world. I only wanted to survive it. But sometimes survival means tearing down what shouldn't have been built. I want you to know I never searched for treasure. I searched for a way to keep you safe, in a world that had forgotten what truth was worth. You will grow up in a time different from mine. People will argue about what's real. They will tell you that truth bends, that facts fade. Don't believe them. Truth doesn't fade, it just waits for someone brave enough to lift the dust again." Her eyes blurred as she reached the end of the page. She folded the letter gently, pressing it back into its place. Then she closed the chest and latched it shut. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of salt and wildflowers through the open window. Somewhere far off, thunder murmured beyond the horizon, distant, harmless. Elena stepped outside onto the porch, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. The sea stretched endlessly before her, silver under the rising moon, the same sea that had swallowed her fear and given her freedom in return. She breathed deeply, feeling the cool air fill her lungs. Behind her, the lights of the foundation glowed like constellations scattered across the hill. Each window framed a flicker of life, young writers still awake, sketching words that might one day change another corner of the world. Elena smiled softly. "That's it," she whispered. "That's the sound of tomorrow." A soft rustle of paper came from behind her. She turned to see Mara standing in the doorway, holding the first printed pamphlet from the Foundation's new project, an anthology titled Echoes of the Forgotten. Across the cover, in simple black ink, was a dedication for Elena Cruz, who turned silence into light. Mara's voice wavered, gentle but sure. "It's ready. The first copies go to the Horizon Archives next week." Elena nodded, her eyes glistening. "Good, that's where it belongs." Mara hesitated. "You should sign it. The world should know your hand touched the first page." But Elena only shook her head, smiling. "No, the story isn't mine anymore. Let it belong to everyone who dares to tell their own." They stood together in the doorway, the sea stretching before them, the wind warm against their faces. The waves rose and fell, reflecting the moonlight in rippling silver lines that seemed to stretch forever. Elena's gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the dark met the light in a seamless line. "Do you think they ever found what the operation was really meant for?" she asked quietly. Mara frowned. "The silver? No." Elena said softly. "The purpose." Mara thought for a moment. Maybe it was never about purpose. Maybe it was a test, to see how long truth could be buried before someone dug it up. Elena smiled faintly. Then I guess we passed. They stood in silence, the waves answering where words could not. Finally, Mara turned to go back inside, but Elena remained where she was, the wind tugging gently at her hair. She tilted her face toward the stars, their light trembling in the sky, infinite and patient. The ocean breathed beneath her, the earth turned, the world kept moving forward, and for the first time she felt the full weight of what she had built, not a rebellion, not a legacy, but a continuum. A quiet current that would keep flowing long after her footsteps were gone. As the night deepened, Elena whispered into the darkness, her voice steady and sure. Sometimes the greatest truth is not the one we find, but the one we leave behind. The words vanished into the wind, carried over the cliffs across the sea, to wherever the light could still reach. The tide rolled in once more, washing over the stones below, tracing and erasing in the same motion, like history, like memory, like grace. And under the silver glow of the moon, Elena Cruz, once a mother, once a fugitive, once the keeper of a buried fortune, closed her eyes and listened to the sound of the waves, content at last to let the truth carry itself, not as a secret, not as a weapon, but as a promise that would never drown,